unexpectedly transported to a foreign realm, while others ascend to immortality or enlightenment. Those less fortunate experience a reversal of fate. Yet, for the hapless Gu Erdan, a glimmer of hope seems utterly unattainable, for he finds himself transformed into a mere skeleton soldier, specifically, a lower-tier, headless, battle-worn skeletal being. In the shadowy realm of the undead, a landscape of corpses and bones stretches endlessly. To the left, 300 kilometers away, lies a putrid wasteland formed from a grotesque accumulation of decaying flesh, teeming with putrefied corpses and shambling zombies. To the right, 500 kilometers distant, stands the infamous Forest of Spirits, where countless vengeful souls and tormented spirits roam. Between these two desolate territories lies the vast Sea of Bones, where mountains and earth are constructed of skeletal remains. And even the trickling black waters of nearby streams conceal darkened bones beneath their surface. Here, the bones vary in age. Some remain remarkably sturdy, while others have succumbed to the ravages of time, brittle and yellowed. A black sun hangs ominously in the sky above a corner of the Sea of Bones, where a multitude of skeleton soldiers congregate, seemingly taking a moment to regroup. In the periphery, a few skeletons stand guard, albeit in a rather unsteady manner, their skeletal frames swaying as their heads bobble aimlessly. Their painfully slow reactions offer little assurance of security. To expect them to detect an enemy would be as futile as hoping the adversary would emerge from the underbrush of their own accord. This contingent of skeletons, numbering in the hundreds, is led by a skeletal wizard, one capable of casting several necromantic spells, exhibiting a modicum of intelligence compared to their brethren. Beside the wizard sits a skeleton clad in tattered armor, brandishing a half-broken iron sword, notably devoid of a head. The gaping void above its severed neck reveals a swirling black mist, within which flickers a faint green ghostly flame, the essence of the undead soul. As long as this flame endures, even if the undead were to be dismembered into 108 pieces, they could still manifest their presence. Gu Erdan gazes at the towering skeletal figures surrounding him, and then glances at the shabbily cloaked skeletal wizard beside him, before lowering his gaze to his own diminutive arms and legs, unable to suppress a sigh of despair. Among the 100 skeletons, the majority, over 70, are first-tier cannon fodder, while a scarce number are first-tier skeletal variants, the skeletal archers, totaling around 20. Lastly, there are the second-tier skeletal guardians, acting as the personal protectors of the skeletal wizard. These formidable skeletal warriors don armor forged from bone and wield weapons similarly crafted. Despite their bony composition, their offensive and defensive capabilities are by no means to be underestimated. To comprehend the prowess of the skeletal guardians, one must recognize that they are elite skeleton warriors capable of matching human soldiers in combat. Unlike the first-tier skeletons that are easily vanquished by militia and lack even a proper designation. If these formidable beings were to engage in battle with skeletons, claiming to hold their ground against 10 adversaries would merely be an act of modesty. As for the leader of this band, the skeletal sorcerer, he epitomizes the quintessential third-tier strength. In truth, any skeleton sorcerer possesses this tier of power. However, their prowess is somewhat inflated, as their innate combat ability raises questions about defeating even a second-tier skeletal guardian. The reason these entities can be classified within the third tier and earn a fearsome reputation as the mightiest of undead creatures, instilling dread in humanity, lies in their enigmatic abilities. The signature skill of the skeletal sorcerer is the resurrection of skeletons, allowing them to transform any corpse into a first-tier skeleton, thus bolstering their forces for battle. They can be regarded as natural leaders, should one encounter a skeletal sorcerer and, unfortunately, be discovered by him in a graveyard. One must tread carefully, for months later, upon returning to that very graveyard, one might be astonished to find their ancestors standing against them, ready to wield their 46-sized shoes to deliver a blow to a 45-sized face. A calamity in one. These beings are akin to miniature harbingers of undead disaster. If not for their limitation to resurrecting only first-tier skeletons, such weaklings, even in vast numbers, pose no threat to major towns. They might not be merely classified as third-tier entities. Contemplating the combat prowess of both sides, and glancing down at his own withered limbs, Gu Erdan once more suppressed the urge surging within him. Gu Erdan, in fact, is human, or at least, he once was. He remains oblivious to how he arrived in this realm, when he crawled out from the pile of bones. He had already transformed into a headless knight, devoid of a steed, armor, or strength. He epitomizes the ultimate degraded version of a headless knight, possessing nothing at all. The sole similarity he shares with a genuine headless knight is the absence of a head. Upon awakening to the realization of his headless state, despair enveloped Gu Erdan. The moment he discovered the absence of his other head, he was overwhelmed by calamity, had it not been for an unfamiliar voice resonating in his mind. providing him with a glimmer of hope as he contemplated ending his existence. His journey as an undead being might have tragically concluded before it even began. A system. The essential boon for any transmigrator is also at Gu Erdan's disposal. However, his system is rather peculiar, while others possess systems that clearly delineate their abilities. Awaiting activation by the host, his idiosyncratic system evolves in accordance with his own desires. Gu Erdan contemplated that having obtained a second chance at life, it would be unthinkable to merely continue as a laborer as in his previous existence. Thus, he harbored grand ambitions of aspiring to dominance. Surely, the system would comprehend this aspiration? As it turned out, the system was indeed quite perceptive, albeit to an excessive degree. The system evolved, transforming from an utterly inept blank slate into the Skeleton Lord system. Name: Skeleton Lord System Energy. 947 Ability: Consumption of energy to enhance undead creatures. Upgrading from first to second tier requires 10 points of energy. From second to third tier, 100 points. From fourth to fifth tier, 1,000 points. From sixth to seventh tier, 10,000 points. From seventh to eighth tier, 50,000 points. From eighth to ninth tier, 100,000 points. Evolving into a Necromancer Lord, equivalent to a human hero or a demon lord of the underworld, necessitates 1,000 points of energy. Transitioning from Necromancer Lord to Necromancer Monarch, comparable to a demigod on earth or a demon king of hell, demands 10,000 points of energy. Ascending from Necromancer Monarch to a low-tier deity requires 100,000 points of energy. The progression does not cease here. Further ascensions to mid-tier deities, high-tier deities, supreme deities, and creator deities are possible, with the energy requirements escalating to absurd levels. What troubled Gu Erdan most was the realization that this system was, in essence, merely a lord system. He could only bolster his soldiers and not enhance himself. Additionally, he could not guarantee the loyalty of his soldiers. This implied that if he inadvertently nurtured a treacherous wretch, his fate would be sealed. Chapter 2. Gu Erdan's Path to Survival Now. 3 months had elapsed since Gu Erdan awoke. During these months, time had stretched unbearably. In the initial week, Gu Erdan evaded various undead creatures that relentlessly pursued him. Skeleton dogs, skeleton sheep, skeleton cows, and even skeleton soldiers would chase him down and attack upon sight. Did they not understand the principle of same root? Why the rush to harm each other? They were all skeletons. Why must skeletons torment their own kind? Naturally, Gu Erdan was acutely aware of why he was being attacked. The reason was painfully simple. He was exceedingly weak. Indeed, he was weak. In the realm of the undead, weakness was a cardinal sin. The newly resurrected skeleton soldiers possessed limited intelligence and were more inclined to act on instinct than thought. Gu Erdan's body, with its frail limbs and bones weathered to a yellowed hue, was merely a hapless weakling among first-tier skeleton soldiers. If they did not strike him down, would they instead offer him a banquet? Name: Gu Erdan. Identity: first-tier skeleton soldier. Weakened version. Ability: first-tier necromantic spell. Bone regeneration. Can consume soul energy to allow undead creatures' bones to regrow. Strength evaluation: a first-tier skeleton soldier is akin to a chicken. And you, not even worthy of being called a chicken. This encapsulates the entirety of Gu Erdan's capabilities, a diminished version of a first-tier physique, with brittle, yellowed bones that can be easily snapped by others, and a bone resurrection technique that proves utterly ineffective in combat. With such feeble prowess, even a freshly revived skeleton soldier could effortlessly dominate him. Logically, one would think that as long as Gu Erdan had any undead subordinate, he could soar to great heights, rapidly accumulating power like a rolling snowball. Unfortunately, the harsh reality remains. In the realm of the undead, weakness is an original sin. With such a pitiable state, how could any skeleton soldier be inclined to ally with him? It would be a miracle if they didn't simply obliterate him on the spot. After several unsuccessful attempts to recruit skeleton soldiers, nearly resulting in his own dismemberment, and even narrowly escaping a fatal encounter with a skeletal hound, Gu Erdan was forced to confront the truth. He was nothing but a worthless entity. Had a regular skeleton soldier faced such a dismal beginning, it would have been time to declare defeat and restart. However, Gu Erdan was not an ordinary skeleton soldier, despite lacking a head. It did not imply he was devoid of wit. Unable to best others in combat, could he not at least seek a powerful ally? After a meticulous selection process and 3 arduous days of searching, Gu Erdan finally identified his desired target, the skeleton wizard. In the Sea of Bones, the skeleton wizard holds a position of considerable influence, for he is perpetually accompanied by a multitude of skeletons, making him a formidable opponent, despite his pitifully weak soul fire. After laboriously vanquishing so many skeletons, Is it truly worthwhile to obtain merely a handful of first-tier soul fires? The skeleton wizard is not entirely inept. However, even this being, regarded as a top-tier third-level undead, possesses soul fire that barely qualifies as third tier. The cost of extinguishing him for his fire would outweigh the benefits. Unable to defeat the formidable, and disinclined to bother with the weak, following the skeleton wizard in the sea of bones is, in fact, the safest course of action. Moreover, Gu Erdan had another motive for aligning himself with this wizard. He possessed the ability to resurrect skeleton soldiers. With so many subordinates at his command, secretly recruiting just 2 should not raise any suspicions, right? With even a single subordinate, Gu Erdan could ascend to greatness. The method by which Gu Erdan integrated himself into the skeleton wizard's entourage was remarkably straightforward. While one might consider stealthily infiltrating the ranks of skeletons to pass off as one of them, such an approach would be tantamount to courting death. A frail, scrawny figure like Gu Erdan would undoubtedly be relegated to the front line as cannon fodder during battles. Whether he engaged or refrained would lead to his demise, resulting in his utter ruin. Instead, Gu Erdan's strategy was not one of subterfuge, but rather a bold approach. He presented himself openly beside the skeleton wizard and proffered his assistance. He sought out an injured skeleton soldier and utilized his bone resurrection technique, successfully reattaching its severed left leg. Indeed, he reattached it. Gu Erdan is far from being one of those foolish skeletons. The totality of his soul's fire is limited. If he were to naively allow this fellow's legs to gradually coalesce, it might be possible, but he would certainly not be able to heal many in a single day. However, the process of bone grafting is a different matter altogether. By selecting a suitable bone segment and applying it to the wound, and subsequently employing the method of skeletal regeneration, the 2 bone fragments will swiftly merge into one. This approach significantly alleviates the consumption of his soul's fire. As for whether the attached bone fits well, that is not Gu Erdan's concern. His sole responsibility is the grafting, not post-operative care. With this skeletal healing technique, Gu Erdan quickly established himself, despite his frail physique, as a specialized bone doctor in the company of the skeletal sorcerer. Moreover, he exclusively tended to the elite warriors, namely the mutated first-tier skeletal archers and the evolved second-tier skeletal guardians. As for the materials he utilized for treating these elite skeletons, he naturally sourced them on-site. When an elite was injured, he would promptly summon a disposable minion, targeting the injury precisely. Nevertheless, despite his elevated status, Gu Erdan's position was not so exalted among this assembly of low-intelligence skeletons as to be considered the skeletal sorcerer's right-hand man. His ascent to this role was primarily due to his cunning and resourcefulness. Gu Erdan was by no means a genius and had never studied tactics. Even the well-known 36 stratagems, he could barely employ the simplest one, strategic retreat. However, this comparison is relative. Compared to ordinary individuals, Gu Erdan is quite average. Yet, when juxtaposed with these brainless bone figures, he emerges as a bona fide genius, a top-tier genius, surpassing the intellectual capabilities of skeletons. Simple tactics, such as luring the enemy into a trap followed by capturing the leader, were employed by Gu Erdan. By sacrificing over 40 disposable minions, he successfully diverted the enemy's main force, ultimately slaying the opposing third-tier skeletal warlord and presenting its soul flame to the skeletal sorcerer, thus rising to become the sorcerer's trusted confidant. During his daily rest, Gu Erdan could sit beside the skeletal sorcerer, a privilege previously reserved solely for skeletal guardians, as no others were allowed near. However, despite his promotion, Gu Erdan's mood did not improve. In fact, it worsened. He realized that his earlier assumptions were entirely misguided. While aligning with the skeletal sorcerer provided a semblance of safety, it did not yield the loyalty of the other skeletons. After all, with a true leader present, who would pledge allegiance to a mere second-in-command? Moreover, the skeletal minds were quite simple. Their thoughts were clear-cut. If one is stronger, they submit. If one is weaker, they are vanquished. Concepts of situational awareness or reading the room were entirely absent. This group of beings did not even entertain the notion of fearing death. Chapter 3. Target. Rebellion. Except for the few advanced guardians painstakingly cultivated by the skeletal sorcerers, Gu Erdan could command the other skeletal soldiers at will. However, he possesses only command authority, which does not imply that he can transcend these skeletal beings. The skeletal sorcerer declares him as the second-in-command. Thus, he is recognized as such. Should the day come when the skeletal sorcerer no longer acknowledges his status, it is likely that Gu Erdan would swiftly meet his demise at the hands of these skeletal soldiers. Faced with this treacherous pack of ungrateful fiends, Gu Erdan finds himself at a loss. He has been mingling with the skeletal sorcerer for over 2 months, having endured numerous skirmishes, the majority of which involved pursuing scattered skeletal remnants that had just been resurrected and had yet to coalesce. At times, He was also tasked with hunting down dogs or capturing sheep, as well as slaying cattle and horses. Among these encounters were a few significant battles. The first being a fierce clash against two third-tier skeletal generals. To be precise, it was those two brash skeletal generals who, emboldened by their numbers, insisted on challenging the skeletal sorcerer directly. It was during that particular battle that Gu Erdan shone brilliantly, earning his position as second in command. In addition, they encountered mutated second-tier skeletal hounds and a sea of first-tier skeletons that instinctively congregated, although their ranks suffered considerable losses each time. This did not detract from their combat effectiveness. After all, skeletal soldiers can be summoned in abundance. As a skeletal sorcerer, what they lack the least is fodder for battle. As long as they do not lose their trusted subordinates, such as the hard-earned evolved skeletal sentinels or the archers whose mutations rely on luck, the skeletal sorcerer would not mourn for a moment even if all other skeletal soldiers perished. Logically, a skeletal sorcerer should be capable of effortlessly assembling a vast army of skeletons. Thousands of skeletal warriors, overwhelming in number, constitute the most terrifying aspect of a skeletal sorcerer. A mere 100-strong squad hardly reflects the prowess of a skeletal sorcerer. This discrepancy primarily arises from geographical constraints. The ability of a skeletal sorcerer to manifest a minor necromantic disaster in the mortal realm hinges on their capacity to intimidate skeletal entities of lesser power, particularly those they have resurrected. However, the same does not hold true in the realm of the undead, where skeletal beings abound, and lesser undead instinctively submit to their higher counterparts. Should the skeletal sorcerer recklessly produce thralls, it is conceivable that in the next battle, when confronted by an opponent of slightly greater strength, those skeletal soldiers, who do not genuinely heed his command but instead submit out of instinct, might turn against him. 100 is the maximum number the skeletal sorcerer can precisely control to prevent their easy betrayal. As for the potential of these skeletal soldiers betraying him when faced with a significantly stronger undead entity, if such a being were to appear, those 100 skeletal soldiers would scarcely suffice as a morsel for the adversary. The question of betrayal would become moot. After a brief respite to mend the damaged skeletal limbs, the formidable 100-strong skeletal squad set forth once more. 20 skeletal warriors advanced at the forefront, tasked with reconnaissance. Yet, relying on them for such duties is, in truth, a futile endeavor. Their foremost utility in advancing lies solely in attracting enemy fire, thereby granting the rear forces precious moments to react. The other skeletal warriors trailing behind gather protectively around the skeletal wizard, with the most pivotal positions occupied by either the skeletal archers or the skeletal guardians. These latter figures serve as the elite troops of the skeletal wizard, their numbers totaling around 30. Meanwhile, Gu Erdan, who also follows closely by the skeletal wizard's side, appears somewhat distracted. Over the past few months, upon realizing that his own abilities would not afford him the chance to recruit the undead, he has begun to devise a new plan. His intentions are simple, encapsulated in 2 words: rebellion. He yearns to eliminate the skeletal wizard, consume his spectral flames, and enhance his own powers. If fortune permits, he would prefer to take command of the wizard's subordinates. After all, while the skeletal guardians are manageable, albeit with a challenging path to advancement, Gu Erdan possesses a system to assist him. However, acquiring the skeletal archers, a mutated version of the first-tier skeletons, proves to be a formidable challenge. Such mutated skeletal warriors, especially those adept in ranged combat, are not entirely absent in the wild. Yet they rarely survive past a single day. An archer, when operating alone, lacks precision in their shots, rendering them easy prey. The skeletal wizard has painstakingly nurtured fewer than 30 archers over the course of more than a year, making the difficulty of inducing their mutations all too apparent. As for the skeletal guardians, their previous numbers were not as scant as they currently seem. Through Gu Erdan's inquiries among the intermittently articulate skeletal guardians, whose minds are severely compromised, he uncovered a secret. The skeletal wizard's subordinates had once rebelled. An exceptionally intelligent skeletal guardian had stealthily evolved into a third-tier skeletal general, leading a nocturnal assault against the skeletal wizard and his forces. That battle resulted in mutual devastation, although the skeletal wizard ultimately quelled the insurrection. His own ranks suffered grievous losses. It is worth noting that a year ago, this individual commanded a 100-strong team, comprised solely of elite skeletal archers or guardians, unlike the dismal situation they face now. Upon learning of this clandestine event, Gu Erdan finally comprehended the reasons behind his abysmal treatment. It dawned on him that there existed a cautionary tale. Gu Erdan is not inherently ungrateful. Had the skeletal wizard shown him a modicum of kindness, he would have been inclined to appoint the wizard to a significant position upon his own ascendance. Even if the wizard refused to join his ranks, they could part amicably. The crux of the matter lies in the fact that this wretched creature refuses to provide him with even the most basic subordinates, let alone the skeletal soldiers that could be summoned at will. Furthermore, by denying him the opportunity to absorb the spectral flames, Gu Erdan has languished for over 2 months, his skeletal frame remaining pitifully frail, easily susceptible to fracture with minimal exertion. It is abundantly clear that the skeletal wizard intends for him to remain a mere medic for life, depriving him of any chance for growth. If it were not for the vanquishing of the undead, how could Gu Erdan possibly amass nearly 1,000 points of energy reserves with his skeletal lord system? It is likely that his energy reserves would still be at a mere 0. Since he shows no mercy, he cannot blame himself for being unjust. The soul fire within his chest flickered slightly as Gu Erdan stealthily cast a glance at the skeletal wizard, who, perched upon a skeletal steed, brazenly nestled at the rear of the group. Gu Erdan longed for a master archer to emerge from the shadows and, from a distance of 1,800 meters, put an end to that wretched creature. After all, everyone else was traversing on foot, while he rode high above them. Alas, such a thought remained a mere fantasy. In the wild, how could there be skeletal archers of the 3rd tier or above? The emergence of a 3rd-tier skeletal warrior from the underbrush held a sliver of possibility. As the team advanced with great momentum, the ghostly shadows of the ghastly weeds, which flourished in the realm of the undead, began to rustle ominously. The skeletal soldiers, startled by the sound, fell into disarray. Some instinctively rushed forward, while those with a modicum of intelligence heeded the skeletal wizard's command to prepare for a defensive formation. In the ensuing chaos, the entire unit became a disorganized mass. Ultimately, it was the skeletal wizard who could no longer tolerate the disorder. He rapped his steed's skull with his staff, producing a resonant thud. Understanding the signal, Gu Erdan swiftly retreated among the skeletons to begin orchestrating their formation. However, before the team could fully assemble, a vast swarm of skeletal soldiers erupted from the distant thicket, their numbers alarmingly overwhelming. There must have been at least 200 or 300. Behind this legion of skeletal warriors approached a skeletal champion, missing an arm and wielding a massive bone axe, striding purposefully towards them. Chapter 4. The vengeful skeletal champion. Upon recognizing the figure, Gu Erdan could not suppress a smile. Ah, an old acquaintance. Was this not the very skeletal champion he had once ambushed, nearly bringing him to his demise? Originally, the champion had operated in tandem with another. But after that fateful battle, one had been dispatched, leaving this one to retreat in a disheveled state, missing an arm. To his surprise, 3 months later, this creature had managed to rally a force and return. Clearly, vengeance was in the air, as he watched the haphazard charge of over 300 skeletal soldiers. Accompanied by the menacing skeletal champion, Gu Erdan felt no trepidation. In the past 3 months, he had witnessed far grander spectacles, let alone these mere cannon fodder. Release. With a furious roar from Gu Erdan, the 20 skeletal archers standing beside him simultaneously released their grips. The black bowstrings, formed of concentrated energy, vibrated as the bone arrows soared through the air, elegantly arcing into the ranks of the skeletal army. Such fragile constructs were not built to withstand such assaults. A mere kick from an average adult could shatter their bones, let alone endure the onslaught of these lethal projectiles. A series of crisp cracks echoed through the air as numerous skeletal figures collapsed to the ground. Although the skeletal warriors were riddled with gaps and should have exhibited significant resistance to piercing weapons such as arrows, the situation was markedly different with the skeletal archers. Their arrows, crafted from their own mutated ribs, possessed a devastating quality. Upon striking their target, they would erupt violently. The bone arrows shattered into countless fragments, releasing a dark, necromantic aura that propelled a multitude of bone shards outward. The effect resembled that of miniature grenades, while the explosive force itself was minimal. The true lethality lay in the bone splinters, which could easily incapacitate the already frail skeletal bodies. After a barrage of arrows, over 30 skeletal warriors fell, unable to rise. Many others, despite having limbs blown off, persisted in their relentless charge. Observing these easily shattered pawns, Gu Erdan shook his head in disbelief. It was no wonder that the tomes he had collected from the corpses referred to undead beings as mere refuse of their tier, particularly the skeletal variety, whose combat prowess was lamentably weak. Instances of ghostly disturbances resulting in a horde of skeletal figures being swiftly dispatched by local militia had become commonplace. Indeed, the combat strength of these bony entities, when confronted one-on-one, paled in comparison to even a single dog. Yet, despite their fragility, the undead's fearless approach to battle remained formidable, especially considering their overwhelming numbers. As the second wave of arrows concluded, the skeletal tide surged forward, with over 200 remaining warriors crashing into the ranks of the skeletal sorcerers, resulting in a fierce and chaotic clash marked by the sounds of cracking bones. The mutated varieties of skeletal warriors were not limited to archers. There were also those wielding shields, axes, knives, and guns. However, their weapons were feeble, and their forms pitiable. Aside from the archers, most lacked any value for cultivation and were collectively dismissed as mere skeletal soldiers. As Gu Erdan surveyed the melee, where both factions wielded a myriad of weapons in a fierce struggle, he raised his hand with an expressionless demeanor. Upon receiving the command, the skeletal archers promptly snapped off a rib, strung their bows, and prepared to fire. With a resonant hum, the bone arrows sliced through the air, accurately finding their targets among the fray. The ensuing cacophony of cracking bones filled the air as numerous arrows detonated, sending bone shards flying and toppling yet more of the skeletal warriors. It was a merciless barrage. How can one not deem these skeletal warriors as utterly foolish? Despite their comrades engaging in battle from the rear, this mindless assembly of bone continues to clash with the enemy, showing no inclination to retreat. It seems they lack even the understanding of what retreat signifies. The chaotic skirmish swiftly culminates, leaving nearly 300 skeletons, who, after enduring 3 successive volleys of arrows, dwindle to a mere scattering of fewer than 100, predominantly comprised of foes. Gazing at these remaining skeletons rushing towards him, Gu Erdan decisively retreats 3 steps, seeking refuge behind the skeletal sorcerer. Who knows what necromantic abilities the enemy might have awakened? Should a fool among them awaken a throwing capability and fortuitously target him, it could lead to his immediate demise. Thus, prudence dictates that he conceal himself for the time being. As Gu Erdan chooses to dodge, throngs of skeletons collide head-on with the skeletal sorcerer's guard. The disparity in strength is starkly evident when the ordinary skeletons encounter the skeletal warriors. One side comprises feeble cannon fodder unable to best even an ordinary human, while the other boasts second-tier warriors who, despite being the weakest among their ranks, can still contest with human second-tier experts for several rounds. In an instant of collision, bones scatter in all directions, some shatter upon striking shields, while others are obliterated by swinging weapons. In the blink of an eye, over 20 of the remaining skeletons are decimated, and should this onslaught persist, they likely will not endure even a minute longer. These skeletal warriors represent the melee elite painstakingly nurtured by the skeletal sorcerer. They are his true trump card for survival. As the skeletal warriors engage fiercely with their foes, a roar emanating from the depths of the soul reverberates through the air, causing the thronging skeletons in the front to disperse in chaos. A colossal skeletal figure, towering over 2.5 meters, brandishes a massive bone axe and charges forth. It is none other than the skeletal champion, now missing an arm. With a thunderous crash, one skeletal warrior, struck directly by the axe, sinks to one knee. His bone shield and integrated arm shattered into countless fragments. Before he can even struggle to rise, a kick to his chest sends his entire frame flying, toppling several skeletal archers standing behind him. Though one arm is severed, the champion's presence remains formidable. His bones shimmer with a jade-like hue, exuding extraordinary resilience. While the weapons of the surrounding skeletal warriors can inflict damage, their effectiveness is minimal, merely inflicting superficial wounds rather than severing limbs, and they fail to hinder his movements. After sending 3 skeletal warriors sprawling, the skeletal champion, brimming with fury, charges towards the skeletal sorcerer, intent on capturing the leader first. Witnessing this scene, the skeletal sorcerer feels a flicker of soul fire in his eyes and tightens his grip on his bone staff. As for Gu Erdan, who was originally hidden behind him, that fellow has long since made his escape. He would never place himself in a perilous situation. After all, what if he were regarded as mere fodder and cleaved in two? Chapter 5. An unavoidable rescue buzz. The sound of bowstrings vibrating resonated as over 20 bone arrows surged forth with deadly precision, striking the charging skeletal general. This barrage of arrows showed no regard for the guards engaged in combat with the skeletal general. It was evident that the skeletal wizard was adept at making sacrifices, opting to preserve the more vital pieces on the board. His choice was undoubtedly astute, as the arrows rained down and exploded upon impact. Although 2 skeletal guards were obliterated on the spot, the remaining guards were left maimed. However, the skeletal general also suffered greatly from the onslaught. Amidst a shower of bone fragments, he was sent hurtling backwards, his entire form rendered a mosaic of destruction, before he could muster the strength to rise from the ground. Several bone spears descended from above, piercing through the gaps in his skeletal frame and pinning him to the earth. The long spear locking technique, a method previously employed by Gu Erdan to vanquish another skeletal general, now replicated by the skeletal wizard, given the inherent gaps in skeletal soldiers' bone structures. If an adversary were to ensnare their joints with weaponry, they would be rendered powerless, left to the mercy of their foes. The skeletal general was now ensnared in such a predicament. Roar! The pinned skeletal general writhed in a frenzy, But alas, it was futile. As he strained to break free from the bone spears, a sudden black mist materialized before him. The skeletal wizard raised his arm, and the mist coalesced above his bone staff, swiftly transforming into a small, translucent bone spear. Whoosh! The three-ring necromancy. Spear of the Dead. This was the skeletal wizard's signature technique, his most formidable means of offense. The previous skeletal general had perished under its lethal strike. The Spear of the Dead could be considered one of the most potent attacks among the three-ring spells, characterized by its formidable penetrating power. However, it demanded immense energy. Given the intensity of the skeletal wizard's soul fire, he could unleash it no more than 3 times within a single day. Moreover, while this technique boasted remarkable penetration, its speed often lacked precision, particularly against agile melee combatants who could easily evade its trajectory. Under normal circumstances, had the skeletal general been vigilant and not too close, he would have evaded this strike. Yet in his current state, pinned to the ground and utterly unable to break free, he unwittingly provided the Spear of the Dead with the most opportune moment for a devastating attack. With a sharp crack, the rapidly launched Spear of the Dead pierced through the skeletal general's chest, shattering his spine and sending ribs and breastbone flying, effectively cleaving him in two. Observing this scene, the skeletal wizard did not lower his guard. Instead, he wielded his staff once more and unleashed another spell. The second Spear of the Dead was released, striking true as it found its mark on the fallen skeletal general, who was now propped up on one arm, struggling to crawl towards him. With a thunderous crash, the skull warrior's head was severed from its body, the already cracked cranium rolling to the feet of the skeletal sorcerer, who promptly crushed it beneath his boot. Gazing at the skull warrior, whose jaws continued to clench in a futile attempt to bite, a glimmer of amusement flickered in the sorcerer's eyes. Another bountiful harvest. Absorbing the soul flames of a foe of equal rank would allow him to evolve rapidly. If this trajectory continued, he would soon transcend the 3rd-tier threshold, ascending to the legendary realm of a 4th-tier skeletal grand sorcerer. At that point, a metamorphosis of extraordinary proportions would unfold. His ability to command a mere 100 would swell to a legion of thousands, transforming into a true army. As the skeletal sorcerer indulged in visions of this splendid future, the skull beneath his foot suddenly stirred. In the next moment, the skull's mouth gaped wide, and as the ghostly flames flickered within, a ball of black mist coalesced and was expelled with a forceful puff. The 2nd-tier necromantic spell, Wraith's Breath. Boom. Caught off guard, the skeletal sorcerer found his leg obliterated, his body teetering precariously before collapsing to the ground. In that moment of fall, he locked eyes with the skull warrior's severed head. Observing its gaping maw and the swirling black mist still gathering within, a wave of dread washed over him. He was on the brink of demise. Boom. Another explosive sound erupted as the expelled black sphere narrowly grazed the sorcerer's crown, leaving a dark mark above him, yet failing to strike true. It was in this critical instant that Gu Erdan, sensing peril, lunged forward, seizing the sorcerer's remaining leg and forcibly dragging him away, thus averting a catastrophic fate. The skeletal sorcerer's reflexes were commendable. In the moment he evaded that onslaught, he raised his finger and decisively targeted the skull warrior's only remaining head. The 3rd spear of the deceased. Fire. With a resounding crash, the skull warrior, still attempting to retaliate, was obliterated, its head shattered into countless fragments, extinguishing its life force. A vast quantity of high-quality soul flames, belonging to the 3rd tier, dispersed and hovered in the air, inciting chaos among the surrounding skeletal soldiers and guardians. This instinctual greed stirred within them. Had they not feared the overwhelming power of their skeletal sorcerer, they would have rushed forth to contest and clash violently amongst themselves. As the skeletal tumult escalated, some even began to advance towards the sorcerer. He, lying on the ground, suddenly emitted a cold snort. With that sound came a pressure of the soul, silencing the frenzied skeletons in an instant. With Gu Erdan's assistance, the skeletal sorcerer swiftly mended his injuries, while the unfortunate soldier who had lost a leg was of no concern to anyone. Rising with the support of his staff, the skeletal sorcerer quickly gathered the cluster of soul flames and, with great satisfaction, settled into a corner to begin his absorption. As for Gu Erdan, who had aided him, he was entirely disregarded. No, not entirely disregarded. Before absorbing the soul fire, this fellow did not forget to issue a command to Gu Erdan to tend to the wounded skeletal guardians. He even assigned 2 skeletal soldiers as aides. Casting a glance at the bony figures trailing closely behind, Gu Erdan's eyes flickered, and he could not help but let out a sigh. Indeed, a thankless wretch. He had saved this creature's life. Not only did he receive no gratitude, but he was also being watched with suspicion. Those 2 skeletal soldiers were hardly helpers. They were clearly there to supervise. Any attempt by Gu Erdan to claim the soul fire would undoubtedly be thwarted by them. Fine, you win. If it weren't for the fear of being torn apart by the other skeletons should you perish, I would never have saved you. Gritting his teeth and muttering in resentment. Gu Erdan had no choice but to comply with the skeletal wizard's orders. His spirits dampened as he began to select bones to heal the others. While he was directing one skeletal soldier in its task, only one could be commanded at a time, leaving the other to keep watch. Gu Erdan inadvertently kicked a skull with his foot. In the next moment, he froze in place, his entire body trembling uncontrollably. This is Chapter 6. The recruitment plan. The skull beneath Gu Erdan's foot was unremarkable, its cracked cranium even bearing a gash made by a blade. If one were to find anything noteworthy, it would be the faint flicker of soul fire still dancing within it. Evidently, it was not yet extinguished. An opportunity. A coveted chance. Though it had no internal organs, Gu Erdan felt his heart racing violently. He had envisioned countless methods of initiation and devised numerous ways to recruit allies. However, due to the watchful eye of the skeletal wizard, most of his plans were rendered impractical. Among the few feasible strategies, only one stood out as the most reliable. He looked up, confirming that the skeletal wizard was engrossed in absorbing the soul fire and was not paying attention to him. He turned his head to survey the scene, observing the foolish skeletal soldier collecting bones, which was also not facing him. The trio that had been monitoring him now consisted solely of the skeletal figure behind him. This was indeed a fortuitous opportunity. Without a moment's hesitation, Gu Erdan twisted his foot slightly, lifting a femur bone onto a pile of other bones. And then he stomped down with force. With a resounding thud, the propelled femur bone struck the unfortunate skeletal soldier right in the groin. Under normal circumstances, those tasked with monitoring Gu Erdan would typically be skeletal guardians, who would easily withstand such trivial tactics. However, today, due to the injuries sustained by the skeletal guardians, a mere minion had been assigned, granting Gu Erdan a chance for success. The launched femur struck the lower limbs of the skeletal soldier, and before it could regain its balance, Gu Erdan was already kicking forcefully at the bones beside him. With a sharp crack, the skeletal warrior was compelled to execute an intense split, losing his balance and collapsing onto the ground. However, his reflexes were remarkably swift. Within a second of hitting the ground, he propped himself up with his hands and raised his head. Clearly, he had not forgotten the task assigned to him by the skeletal sorcerer, his gaze unwaveringly fixed on the target. After surveying the surroundings and confirming there was nothing amiss, the skeletal warrior shakily rose to his feet once more. As he stood behind Gu Erdan, he began to inspect his own body for injuries. At that moment, the skull above Gu Erdan's neck suddenly rotated a full 180 degrees with a distinct crack. Gazing at the swaying head, which hung limply with a flickering flame of soul within, the skeletal warrior stared in bewilderment. Noticing this peculiar scene, Gu Erdan hastily extended his hands to grasp the skull and forcefully twisted it back. With a creaking sound, the head was compelled to face forward again. Observing Gu Erdan, who was now stabilizing his head as he wobbled forward, the skeletal warrior found himself perplexed. It must be said, the figure ahead appeared somewhat strange. Yet there seemed to be nothing overtly odd about it. One head, two hands, it seemed quite normal. Gu Erdan, with both hands firmly gripping his head to prevent it from rotating, finally relaxed a bit when he confirmed that the skeletal warrior had no intention of forcibly removing his head. How wonderful! At last, he had received his first reward from that miserly skeletal sorcerer. He was soaring to new heights, like a dragon diving into the sea, destined for greatness and resplendent achievements. His future was bright with promise. With one hand pressed against his head, Gu Erdan began his customary healing process, accompanied by the incantation of the bone regeneration spell. The injured skeletal guardians swiftly regained their vitality. This treatment was brief, for unlike flesh, bones required no elaborate medical care. Once the bones were reconnected and the spell cast, the fractured pieces naturally aligned. Having resolved everything, the skeletal guardians commenced the task of clearing the battlefield, while Gu Erdan was unceremoniously pushed aside, no longer permitted to approach any spoils. In days gone by, Gu Erdan would have unleashed a torrent of complaints, perhaps even resorting to petty tricks, such as using the bone regeneration spell to beautify these ruffians, merely to vent his frustrations. Yet today he remained silent, finding a secluded corner to sit with his head cradled in his hands. Once he confirmed he was alone, he abruptly removed his head. Staring at the skull in his hands, which seemed to be trying to bite him, Gu Erdan suddenly found it remarkably endearing. Little brother, look at you. In such a pitiful state, reduced to just a head. And me, I am but refuse among skeletal warriors. We are two peas in a pod, both crows. Let us not mind our color. Why not form a little team? I have a name in mind. Let us call ourselves Northeast F4. I shall take the role of the big brother, for I am a tad smarter. You may henceforth refer to me as Wu Yinzu. gently stroking his tattered skull. Gu Erdan commenced his recruitment efforts, his tone remarkably gentle. However, the other party was utterly unresponsive, not only failing to reciprocate with kindness, but even attempting to bite him. Witnessing this scene, Gu Erdan's eyes twitched, and he could not help but curse inwardly. What a bunch of dim-witted fools. How could they lack even the slightest discernment? He was left with nothing but a skull. Though somewhat damaged, slightly yellowed, and a bit useless, he was nonetheless whole. If he couldn't best the other skeletons, could he not contend with the current one? Sigh. If you refuse to be my subordinate, so be it. Let us stand as equals. We are both reduced to this state. Our circumstances similar. I am willing to bind our fates as brothers of different bones. What say you? Come now. Let us emulate the three brothers of the peach garden. We do not seek to be born on the same year, month, and day, but rather to die on the same year, month, and day. How does that sound? Oh, my dear elder brother, what is it that you truly desire? If all else fails, I can concede to you as the elder brother. I implore you, accept me swiftly. You old rascal. Do not refuse a toast, and instead drink a penalty. Today, I shall reveal my might to you. I shall show you the true extent of my capabilities. As his patience waned and anger surged, Gu Erdan let out a low growl and dug a pit in the ground, stuffing the skull into it. He then forcefully snapped one of his ribs, shaping it into a delicate gesture, and began to knock rhythmically while reciting incantations. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Oh, red-skinned skull, today I shall style you with the hair of Shakyamuni. May you soon embrace the path of Buddha and understand the advantages of being my subordinate. Namo Amitba. Namo Amitba. Namo Amitba. The continuous sound of knocking echoed as Gu Erdan began his unconventional persuasion. The skeleton soldiers and guards, drawn by the commotion, approached to investigate. However, by this time, the skull had been buried, leaving only the top of the skull exposed. On the bone-laden ground, who would notice the sudden appearance of a crown? Not comprehending Gu Erdan's actions, they quickly departed, leaving him persistently striving to persuade his would-be brother to abandon his wicked ways. Chapter 7. The first bucket of gold. As the saying goes, nothing in this world is insurmountable if one is willing to exert effort. Heaven ultimately does not forsake those with determination. After more than an hour of relentless knocking, Gu Erdan finally witnessed results. The skeleton soldier, whose crown was nearly shattered from the incessant pounding, seemed to realize that such a fate would undoubtedly lead to his demise and ultimately chose to submit. Sensing the aura of submission emanating from the skeleton soldier, Gu Erdan trembled with excitement throughout his entire skeletal frame. He extended his hand, gently probing into the eye socket of the skull. In the next moment, a unique force belonging to the soul surged forth, instantaneously merging with the flame of Gu Erdan's soul. In that instant, Gu Erdan felt as though he had reached the pinnacle. His entire being quivered with the resonance of his soul. In his mind, enchanting melodies seemed to resonate. This electrifying sensation had gradually begun to manifest. The tingling sensation was akin to being charged with electricity. Shaking his body, he forced himself to awaken, swiftly retrieving the skull and pressing it once more against his neck. This time, however, the skull offered no resistance, behaving as docile as a pet cat. The soul oath, a common means of subjugation among the undead. The method of its execution was remarkably simple. One merely needed to allow the other party to relinquish a fragment of their soul's flame to oneself, which could then be consumed by one's own soul flame, thus granting dominion over the other's life and death, capable of obliterating their very essence at a whim. At this moment, Gu Erdan had also entered into such an oath with the skeletal sorcerer, which meant that his life was now firmly within the sorcerer's grasp. This was the principal reason for Gu Erdan's dissatisfaction and his fervent desire to rebel. Having entrusted his very existence to another, he found it utterly disheartening that the sorcerer remained so guarded against him, as if he were not regarded as one of their own. To allow the horse to run without providing it with fodder, would it not kick you in retaliation? If even a horse could feel such injustice, how much more so could a living being, or rather, a being who had passed away? Escaping the shackles of the soul was no simple task, typically achievable through one of two means. The first was to seek a more powerful undead entity to assist in breaking the oath. The second involved attaining a level of soul flame intensity that rivaled or surpassed that of the dominant party, thereby forcibly extinguishing one's own fragments of the soul. Neither of these methods were suitable for Gu Erdan. He was unfamiliar with advanced undead and was merely a lowly first-tier skeleton. To expect him to ascend to the third tier was akin to waiting for the next millennium. Yet, he must not forget that he possessed the skeleton lord system. If he could not elevate himself, could he not help his underlings ascend instead? As long as he ensured their loyalty and fortified their strength, he could easily vanquish the skeletal sorcerer and reclaim his freedom. Filled with exuberance, Gu Erdan began discreetly crafting a body for his skeletal underling. The sea of bones lacked many resources, yet it overflowed with bones. Although the quality of the bones strewn across the ground was questionable, some crumbled at the slightest touch. Having a skeleton was certainly better than having none at all. After toiling for several minutes, carefully avoiding detection, Gu Erdan finally completed the assembly of his first underling just before the skeletal sorcerer absorbed the soul flame. Gazing at the conspicuous figure, a patchwork of white and yellow bones, Gu Erdan stroked his chin, brows furrowed in contemplation. After much hesitation, he gritted his teeth and chose to spend some energy to enhance this creation. As the system activated, an energy resembling soul flames, yet entirely black, surged from Gu Erdan's chest, gradually merging with the makeshift skeleton before him. Before him, the fragile bones of the skeleton soldier were continuously washed and reinforced by energy. The dull yellow hue faded, and the cracks mended. When the energy was finally depleted, what appeared before Gu Erdan was a pristine skeleton soldier, entirely white and devoid of any scars. At this moment, Gu Erdan maintained a distance of at least 3 meters from the skeleton soldier, refraining from approaching recklessly. Instead, he chose to examine it through the system. Name, skeleton soldier rank, peak level 1, on the verge of promotion, skill, first ring necromancy bone armor condensation combat power, capable of defeating a dog, presumably. Gazing at the attributes before him, Gu Erdan nodded in satisfaction. He had intentionally limited the enhancement to peak level 1 because, once a subordinate's strength surpassed his own, the pitiful intelligence of the skeleton soldiers would almost invariably lead them to revolt. At the same level, the so-called soul contract would theoretically become ineffective, should they desire. There was a significant possibility that the fragments of his soul fire could be destroyed. However, based on Gu Erdan's observations, skeleton soldiers, especially the lower-tier ones, often lacking in intellect, should not possess the ambition or desire to rebel. As long as they served as a deterrent, they would likely not choose to resist him. Picking up a rib from the ground, Gu Erdan, keeping his distance, began to prod at the skeleton soldier's head incessantly. After a half-day of continuous testing, confirming it showed no signs of rebellion, Gu Erdan finally breathed a sigh of relief. His first subordinate had finally arrived. How wonderful! With excitement, he rubbed his hands together, beginning to devise his next plan around his new ally. Gu Erdan's subsequent strategy was straightforward and clear, the often-cited snowball tactic. Create an advantage and expand it. Although he still lacked the power to compel other skeleton soldiers to submit, this remarkably strong peak level 1 skeleton soldier was already qualified to do so. As the saying goes, a subordinate is also a subordinate of one's own. By having his new ally gather an army, he could bolster his strength. He envisioned having it recruit more soldiers and infiltrate the ranks of the skeleton wizards. Once a considerable force was amassed, Gu Erdan would be able to lead them to seize the skeleton wizards and become a true master of the undead. The skeleton wizards absorbed soul fire at an astonishing rate. Within 2 hours, the reinvigorated army set out once more, embarking on aimless patrols. Regardless of the enemies encountered, they would charge forward and unleash a flurry of strikes until their foes lay dead. This was the survival law of the realm of the undead. Every day, hundreds of thousands of undead perished, only to have thousands upon thousands more resurrected. The weak would die, and the strong would evolve. Among the towering heaps of bones, how many had already been revived and fallen once more? Perhaps no one could truly know. In the blink of an eye, half a month had passed, and the ranks of the skeleton wizards had grown increasingly elite and formidable. From a distance, a skeletal army marched in a straight line, with 20 expendable minions at the forefront serving as bait. These minions varied in appearance. Some were ghastly pale while others bore a yellowish hue. Trailing behind them were the skeletal wizards, including Gu Erdan, accompanied by skeletal guards and archers. However, their numbers had dwindled. Only 7 skeletal guards remained, and the originally over 20 skeletal archers had been reduced to 14, among which 5 were alarmingly white, indicating their imminent advancement. The reserve troops following at the rear were uniformly composed of pristine white skeletons, devoid of any cracks, undoubtedly the elite among the first-tier skeletons. This was the fruit of Gu Erdan's efforts over the past fortnight. The initial phase of any endeavor is always the hardest, but once the situation is set in motion, it tends to become increasingly manageable. Recruiting subordinates is akin to this. Once the first ally is secured, finding the second and third becomes a trivial pursuit. Like a snowball effect, Gu Erdan swiftly amassed over 70 new followers. Although these individuals were merely the subordinates of his subordinates, they nonetheless heeded his commands. Chapter 8. The chosen resting place, standing beside the skeletal wizard, Gu Erdan discreetly observed him. In truth, he need not be covert, for he possessed neither a head nor any features that could be scrutinized. Who would discern his gaze? Manipulating a fist-sized skull, the origin of which was unknown, Gu Erdan felt a heaviness in his heart. Despite having effectively replaced the skeletal minions under this wizard's command and subtly eliminating many of his trusted subordinates, significantly weakening his defenses, the adversary remained a formidable third-tier skeletal wizard, even though his own forces had been bound by a pyramid-like soul pact. A mere third-tier undead was insufficient to sway this horde of skeletons to mutiny. The disparity in combat power was glaringly evident, especially considering this wizard wielded the deadly spear of the dead. If struck by his javelin, Gu Erdan would surely meet his demise. What to do? A direct assault is not an option. I cannot guarantee he won't strike first, nor can I ascertain whether these first-tier skeletons can vanquish him. I must devise a plan to exhaust his energy first. With thoughts racing, Gu Erdan contemplated possible strategies. Engaging the skeletal wizard head-on was perilously reckless, particularly with his life hanging in the balance. It was imperative to first diminish the wizard's power, ideally by eliminating his personal guard, namely those second-tier skeletal guards. Without their protection, confronting such a ranged spellcaster would become considerably more manageable. Drawing forth a rudimentary abstract map he had sketched, Gu Erdan began to examine the nearby marked formidable foes. In truth, the resources of the realm of the undead were not scarce. The corpses here were a motley assortment, seemingly transported from various planes. A multitude of lifeless objects accompanied them upon their arrival, including weapons, armor, and various implements, none of which were particularly remarkable. However, for reasons unknown, the majority exhibited significant corrosion. The tattered chainmail adorning ancient Erdan and the rusted half of a samurai sword he clutched served as the most compelling evidence. He even encountered a large wooden sailing ship from World War I atop a hill of skeletons. Despite the numerous lifeless entities he had witnessed over nearly 4 months of wandering, not a single living creature had crossed his path, though he did come across several rapidly decaying corpses. After scrutinizing the unusually decomposing bodies, ancient Erdan arrived at a harrowing conclusion. The air in the realm of the undead was likely toxic. Everything, save for the undead, appeared to corrode at an alarming rate. Otherwise, with so many corpses entering this realm, it was illogical that not a single living soul remained, with a plethora of spoils that had entered alongside them. It was equally baffling that each one was rusted and decayed. Equipped with paper and pen, ancient Erdan began to mark and sketch on the map. To the left, approximately 10 miles away, lay a small canyon where the resurrection rate of skeletons was markedly higher than outside. A herd of skeletal horses occupied the area, perpetually engaging in the grim game of whack-a-mole with the resurrecting skeletons, led by a third-tier skeletal horse king, whose ability seemed to be the creation of more skeletal steeds. Their last encounter had been 2 months prior, with their numbers exceeding 200. This was untenable. The cavalry charge would be devastating, especially in the canyon, where the long tunnels were perfectly suited for their onslaught. The risk of confrontation was far too great. To the right, about 5 miles away, loomed a solitary giant skeleton, presumably still in its youth, standing approximately 5 meters tall. However, the last time ancient Erdan crossed paths with this creature, the skeletal sorcerer had retreated without a word, most likely due to the giant's combat prowess exceeding that of a third tier. The sorcerer's cowardice was a concern. Had he chosen to withdraw while sending his minions to draw the giant's fire, it might have been a miscalculation leading to greater losses. He recalled encountering a nest of bone-armored mantises about 15 miles back, creatures of second-tier strength, notorious for their decapitation tactics of targeting the strongest adversaries first. When last encountered, their numbers ranged between 20 and 30. This could be worth a trial, as the feeble skeletal soldiers would not attack unless provoked. Was this an instinct developed in life or a cunning strategy to serve as bait for drawing in second-tier skeletons? Resolute in his decision, ancient Erdan secured the map, binding it to a rib bone. He had never cared who had slain the skeletal sorcerer. His singular aim had always been the demise of the sorcerer, to reclaim his freedom. The bone-armored mantises exhibited peculiar habits, eschewing attacks on prey they deemed unworthy, typically opting to ambush entities of equal strength, demonstrating remarkable lethality. When ancient Erdan had previously traversed their territory alone, he had initially failed to notice their presence, until a second-tier skeletal soldier inadvertently found itself in this territory while pursuing other skeletons. It was abruptly torn to shreds by a swarm of over 20 bone-armored mantises that surged from the ground. It was then that Gu Erdan realized the presence of such a horde of monsters engaged in a hunt. Terrified, he fled for over 2 miles before daring to stop. Having chosen his target, Gu Erdan naturally would not hesitate any longer. He subtly adjusted his troops' direction, skirting the edge of a mountain, and after a discreet detour, the group began to retrace their steps. The skeletal wizard paid little heed to this sudden change in direction. He did not even notice it. After all, despite possessing a higher intelligence than his peers, his cognitive abilities were still quite limited, as he commanded a group of mindless skeletons. What intelligence could one expect from them? As long as there were skeletons to slay and soul fires to consume along the way, the skeletal wizard paid no mind to the direction he took. Before Gu Erdan's arrival, his subordinates had been wandering aimlessly. It could even be said that Gu Erdan and his companions had previously been circling, never straying more than 10 miles from their starting point. The outside world represented the unknown, and no one could predict whether venturing too far would lead to formidable foes. Thus, barring exceptional circumstances, the vast majority of skeletons would never leave their territory throughout their lives. They would only choose to depart after being killed or upon reaching a certain level of power. After another day's journey, upon reaching the marked area on the map, Gu Erdan promptly ordered his troops to rest. He settled into a corner, guarded by a few elite subordinates, and secretly opened his map for comparison. A massive, incomplete skeletal bull's head, a row of towering ribs embedded in the ground. Additionally, wandering around were first-tier skeletons, none exceeding the second tier. All characteristics of the plains were accurate. This is the spot, without a doubt. Gazing at the abstract skeletal bull's head depicted on the map alongside the 12 massive ribs protruding from the earth, Gu Erdan meticulously compared the details and, upon confirming their accuracy, excitedly stowed the map away. Stealing a glance at the skeletal wizard, Gu Erdan clenched his fists. The burial site had been identified for the enemy, and now, it was time to set the trap. With a sycophantic bow, Gu Erdan's tone turned exceptionally obsequious. "My lord, please come inside." Chapter 9. For the sake of freedom in the face of Gu Erdan's unwarranted flattery, the skeletal wizard remained unguarded, indifferent to this eccentric subordinate. As long as he could assist with tasks and cultivate elite warriors, he had no intention of allowing such a subordinate any opportunity for growth. The reason was simple. This lad was far too clever. His previous astute subordinate had ultimately opted for rebellion, nearly bringing about his downfall. The skeletal wizard was merely dull, not foolish. Having learned from past misfortunes, he certainly would not fall for the same trick twice. This is also the primary reason why he has consistently forbidden Gu Erdan from devouring the soul fire for growth. During this period, with numerous subordinates assisting in the collection of soul fire, Gu Erdan's skeletal frame remains notably yellow, predominantly due to this restriction. If there were any changes to his skeleton, the skeletal sorcerer would undoubtedly realize that he was pilfering, leading to either heightened scrutiny or, in the worst-case scenario, his immediate demise. Thus, Gu Erdan resolutely resisted temptation, converting all the gathered soul fire into system energy instead of absorbing it himself, all for the sake of today. The grand army marched forth with great momentum. Yet this time, there was a distinct difference. Typically, this 100-strong unit advanced in a dense formation to evade surprise attacks from formidable foes. However, today they gradually spread out, ultimately forming a loosely arranged scale-like formation. The skeletal sorcerer certainly took note of this shift, but deemed it inconsequential, as Gu Erdan provided a plausible explanation. With countless first-tier skeletons meandering about, there was no need for the entire army to mobilize collectively. It would be far too time-consuming. Hunting in smaller groups was the most efficient strategy, rendering the army's dispersal entirely justifiable. Gu Erdan, shadowing the skeletal sorcerer, subtly distanced himself from them, apprehensive that when the bone-armored mantis struck, he might be regarded as mere fodder. Were it not for the skeletal sorcerer's restrictions preventing him from straying too far, Gu Erdan would have relished the opportunity to distance himself by an unfathomable extent. As he busily adjusted his armor, he even rummaged through his tattered backpack to procure a helmet, which bore a solitary skeletal visage beneath it. With his gear fully equipped, Gu Erdan now exuded the semblance of an ancient warrior. As he traversed the smooth plain, he waited patiently, and after a considerable duration, he finally encountered the legendary ambush. Suddenly, with a resounding crash, the once flat terrain erupted as skeletal fragments scattered. Dozens of bone-armored mantises, concealed beneath the surface, emerged with a violent thrust, wielding massive bone scythes that swiftly felled the skeletal sentinels. Caught off guard by the ambush, the entire skeletal battalion fell into disarray. The outermost skeletons remained obliviously engaged in their hunting endeavors, while those meant to defend the center either advanced toward the commotion or fled in panic. Only the first 20 expendables in the front lines maintained a semblance of order, charging back in a desperate attempt to intercept the assailants. This chaotic scene left the skeletal sorcerer in a state of bewilderment. He had always been confident in his subordinates' military prowess. Yet how could they falter so poorly against a mere dozen adversaries today? Turning his gaze in confusion, he discovered that the anticipated presence of Gu Erdan was absent. Instead, he beheld the lifeless form of a fallen body, with a broken blade protruding from Gu Erdan's chest, piercing through to the other side. Due to the obstruction of his armor, it was unclear whether the strike had struck a vital essence. As the figure collapsed dramatically to the ground, its limbs sprawled wide. The skull adorned with a helmet tumbled away. This bewildered the large mantis that had just emerged from the shadows, prodding the fallen skull with its scythe-like appendage. The mantis discovered that the impact had shattered the jaw. It gazed at its own sharp claws in confusion. When had it become so formidable? Had it truly frightened a skeletal soldier to death upon its entrance? Could it be that it had unwittingly evolved to the third tier? Overwhelmed with joy, the mantis spread its wings, eager to let out a triumphant roar. However, just at that moment, a spear of the deceased flew through the air, instantly shattering its head into fragments. "Damn it," came the hoarse, stuttering voice of a skeletal wizard, whose intellect surpassed that of the average skeleton. He could not help but curse vehemently. Dead. To perish at such a critical juncture. This creature had poor timing indeed. Had he known, he would have reinforced it a bit, letting out a ferocious cry. An intangible wave of spiritual energy emanated from him as the wizard attempted to command his skeletal minions through this method. Yet, unbeknownst to him, his skeletal soldiers had long been stealthily replaced by ancient Erdan's subordinates. Even if he shouted for an entire day, it would be of no avail. Realizing that aside from the 20 cannon fodder returning from a distance, along with his personal guard, the remaining skeletons remained unresponsive to his commands, the skeletal wizard, though momentarily taken aback, had no time to ponder further. "Regroup. Command the skeletal guardians to converge upon him." The skeletal wizard began to assert his power. With a first-tier spell, he resurrected several skeletons to disperse their firepower across the battlefield. Following that was a second-tier spell, the Hand of Death. As his staff struck the ground, a vast aura of ghostly energy spread forth, coalescing into numerous translucent, withered hands that relentlessly grasped at the limbs of the enemies, slowing them down or even halting them completely. These hands possessed little strength. A normal person could easily break free. Yet, the sheer number of them was overwhelming. The multitude of arms emerging from the ground was enough to incite panic in those with claustrophobia. Once a hand seized an individual, if they failed to escape in time, they would be swiftly ensnared by a multitude of hands, pinning them in place. It must be said that the abilities of this skeletal wizard were indeed formidable, featuring both crowd control and targeted elimination, perfectly designed for combat scenarios. As the Hand of Death was unleashed, the once dominant armored mantises found their combat effectiveness severely diminished. The skeletal wizard unleashed 2 spears of the deceased in quick succession, exploding the heads of 2 mantises immobilized in place. Upon sensing the drain of the soul fire energy within him, he suddenly pointed to the side. In the next moment, a skeletal archer, who had been fervently attacking alongside him, felt the soul fire within him erupt violently, shattering his skull and unleashing the dispersed soul fire towards the skeletal wizard, who swiftly absorbed it entirely. Remarkably, he chose to control the fragments of souls to eliminate his own subordinate, with their soul flames rapidly replenishing their strength. This move could hardly be deemed merciful, yet it proved exceedingly effective. The skeletal sorcerer swiftly transformed the energy from the ghostly flames, raising his hand to unleash 2 more spears of the deceased, while simultaneously casting a spell of Death's Hand. Depleted of energy once more, he pointed his staff at another archer. The thunderous roars echoed continuously as Gu Erdan, lying on the ground and feigning death beneath his armor, secretly peered through the gaps to assess the situation. To his dismay, the battle was not unfolding as he had anticipated. The skeletal sorcerer was not cornered but rather thriving, ruthlessly transforming into a cannon, swiftly annihilating several bone-armored mantises. Gu Erdan could not help but furrow his brow. This was untenable. If things continued down this path, the skeletal sorcerer would undoubtedly emerge victorious. When he eventually discovered Gu Erdan's ruse, it might very well lead to his eternal slumber. Clenching his fists in determination, Gu Erdan swiftly transmitted orders through the connection of their soul pact. Upon receiving the command, the skeletal soldiers, who had been idly brandishing their weapons and watching the spectacle, suddenly ignited with fervent flames in their eyes and turned their blades upon their fellow brethren. More precisely, it was those who had obeyed the skeletal sorcerer's commands and had even pledged their souls to him. Chapter 10. A dimensional blow from intelligence. When confronted with a formidable foe that proves difficult to contend with, one must first sever their wings, cut off their supplies, and disturb their peace of mind before they can be vanquished. To Gu Erdan, the skeletal sorcerer indeed posed a formidable challenge, yet not to an insurmountable extent. Yet, engaging in a direct confrontation with the enemy was the most foolish act of a brute, especially when aware that the adversary could inflict tremendous damage upon one's own forces. As Gu Erdan observed the skeletal sorcerer transform into a cannon, he decisively commanded his skeletal soldiers to commence the slaughter of the sorcerer's subordinates. Initially, the skeletal sorcerer remained indifferent to the demise of his minions, for he had long grown accustomed to the death of his subordinates. It was only when he realized that the pool of expendable minions to replenish his energy was dwindling, and he could scarcely conjure the spears of the deceased, that he understood the gravity of the situation. By that time, the bone-armored mantises were mostly defeated, with only a few puny remnants remaining. In truth, were they to face ordinary third-tier undead, they would not have suffered such dire losses. Even with casualties, it would likely amount to only 4 or 5. However, little did they expect that the skeletal sorcerer had concealed such a trump card. Faced with the piercing power of the spears of the deceased, the once proud bone armor of the mantises became utterly futile. With the exit of the bone-armored mantises, the battle had devolved into a confrontation among the skeletons. A horde of peak first-tier skeletal soldiers surged forth, wielding an array of weapons, leaving the skeletal guardians in disarray, utterly unable to defend themselves. Notably, among this throng of skeletal warriors, there were even 5 or 6 skeletal archers who favored concentrating their fire on a single skeletal guardian, managing to eliminate one with nearly every round of attack. Even the skeletal guardians find themselves in such a dismal state, let alone the feeble skeletal archers. As the ranks of his skeletal soldiers dwindled, the reasonably intelligent skeletal wizard began to feel a sense of panic. Should this onslaught continue, he was likely to be overwhelmed and perish. Once his minions were entirely vanquished and his internal energy fully depleted, his combat prowess would scarcely rival that of a mere skeletal guardian. Retreat. He must retreat. A thought flashed through his mind as the skeletal wizard commanded the few remaining skeletal guardians to shield him while he attempted to break free. In a reckless dash, relying on the guardians' fearless tenacity to delay their attackers, the skeletal wizard finally managed to escape the encirclement, though not without sustaining considerable damage. His once immaculate and snow-white bones were now marred by numerous cuts. Even the beloved bone staff in his grasp had shattered during the recent assault by the skeletal soldiers. The skeletal wizard, in a state of utter disarray, felt both aggrieved and furious. How had he fallen to such depths? Even during the rebellion of his soldiers, he had maintained an air of calm, akin to a general observing from the sidelines. Yet today, he had been bested by a horde of first-tier skeletal soldiers, mere fodder. Why had they turned against him? Who was orchestrating this betrayal? Who had so silently replaced his subordinates? A torrent of questions surged within him, causing the already dim-witted skeletal wizard to experience a throbbing headache. Turning to the 3 remaining skeletal guardians at his side, he forcefully suppressed his anger and sighed inwardly. It appeared he truly had to start anew, but this was not insurmountable. He was on the verge of ascending to the realm of a 4th-tier archmage. If he could successfully advance, then the losses incurred today would be but a drop in the ocean. Discarding his shattered bone staff, the skeletal wizard suddenly reached out, brutally snapping off a rib from one of his subordinates and affixing it to his own fractured rib. He then scanned his surroundings, searching for the healer, Gu Erdan. After instinctively glancing around, the skeletal wizard suddenly froze, and after a moment, let out a resigned sigh. He had forgotten that the first-tier healer had been swiftly eliminated by a bone-armored mantis at the outset. Now, with the healer he had painstakingly acquired dead, and one who was highly skilled in strategy, the loss weighed heavier on him than the demise of a single skeletal guardian. Had he known, he would have reinforced the healer, even if only to elevate him to the pinnacle of first-tier status, granting him some measure of self-preservation. Had he perhaps been too cautious? With a few guardians in tow, he pressed onward, daring not to pause for a moment. Yet as he ran, a sudden realization struck him within his sea of souls. The fragments of the healer strategist's soul fire had not shattered, indicating that he was still alive. Suddenly halting his steps, the skeletal sorcerer turned with excitement, gazing into the distance at the battlefield behind him. He was still alive? This was indeed splendid news. All he had to do was swiftly resurrect a horde of expendable minions and successfully locate that clever individual. Relying on that person's strategies, he could surely devour those detestable skeleton soldiers. With determination, the skeletal sorcerer began to wave his staff, channeling the scant remnants of necromantic energy that had just revitalized within him, and in one breath, he resurrected over a dozen expendable skeletons. He was prepared to lead them into battle. Just as the skeletal sorcerer was nervously reviving his minions, ready to regroup, a sudden, thunderous noise erupted from the nearby skeletal hillock. The bones piled at the cave's entrance were violently displaced, and dozens of skeleton soldiers, hidden within, emerged brandishing their weapons. Their pristine white bones, a peak of the first tier, clearly indicated that these beings were allies of the previous group. They had been lying in ambush. As he beheld the oncoming horde that shattered the minions he had painstakingly summoned and charged recklessly towards him, the skeletal sorcerer's mind went blank. At that moment, the last vestiges of energy within him were entirely depleted. He raised his hand in an attempt to cast a spell. But even the most rudimentary resurrection of skeletons eluded him. With a resounding crash, the skeletal sorcerer was swiftly overwhelmed beneath a tide of bones. In a clash of intellects, the reasoning of the living faced off against the minds of the dead, resulting in a decisive defeat. A being who had been recently revived for no more than 3 years, encountering his kind, was either dim-witted or utterly foolish. What could his own intelligence amount to? Although Gu Erdan was not particularly skilled in strategy, it was effortless for him to bully a simpleton skeleton. Minutes later, adorned with a skeletal head, Gu Erdan swaggered onto the battlefield, leading a multitude of skeleton soldiers. Observing the chaos strewn across the ground, alongside the remains of those with shattered skulls, especially upon noticing the corpse of the skeletal sorcerer, Gu Erdan nodded in satisfaction. He was finally free. Moreover, he had acquired his own subordinates. Ah, skeletal sorcerer, the leader I initially chose. Since we cannot coexist, you shall become the first cornerstone beneath my feet. Approaching the skeleton soldiers he had previously laid in ambush, Gu Erdan casually extended his hand, ready to await the surrender of their spoils. However, observing the unmoving skeletons before him, who offered no response, Gu Erdan furrowed his brow. Had their numbers diminished? To contend with a skeletal sorcerer who could scarcely cast a spell, along with 3 maimed skeletal guardians, did it truly warrant the loss of over half their ranks? Among the 30 or so who had been lying in wait, there were now barely 10 remaining? How had these fools engaged in battle? Had they charged headfirst into the enemy's weapons? The more he scrutinized, the more he sensed something amiss. Suddenly, Gu Erdan appeared to recollect something significant. His expression shifted dramatically as he hurriedly accessed the system to examine them. In the next moment, a plethora of data materialized before Gu Erdan. Chapter 11. The Instinct of the Undead Name. Bone Warrior Identity. Second Tier Undead. Inferior. Skills. First Circle Spell. Hardened Skeleton. Second Circle Spell. Spectral Spear Toss. Synopsis. If a first-tier skeleton soldier were to confront an adult human, it would be akin to a dog encountering a person. However, when faced with a second-tier skeleton soldier, the dynamics of their identities would be entirely reversed. Gazing at the data of the several skeleton soldiers before him, Gu Erdan felt an unsettling flicker of soulfire within his chest. They have evolved. This motley crew has undergone an evolution. Oh no. The soulfire, seeping through the crevices of their armor, scanned the corpses strewn across the ground. And Gu Erdan swiftly grasped the unfolding situation. It was highly probable that this band of skeletons, after dispatching the skeleton sorcerer, succumbed to the temptation of the third-tier soulfire, ultimately allowing their primal instincts to overpower their oaths, opting instead to devour the spoils alone. The reason for their substantial casualties could very well be attributed to their internecine conflicts over the loot. As he surveyed the 9 second-tier skeleton soldiers standing before him, Gu Erdan's mind buzzed, and he suddenly roared with fury while retreating frantically. Attack! With this command, the skeletons standing behind him advanced without hesitation, drawing their weapons and lunging forward. The advanced skeletons under siege responded in kind, seizing their own weapons to counterattack. What had once been a cohesive group of skeletons erupted into chaos. This is the nature of survival in the realm of the undead. There is no kinship, no camaraderie, no bonds, and no trust. The weak submit to the strong. This is the fundamental truth of this place. Once a weakling becomes strong, the strong will turn upon one another, battling until one reverts to weakness or meets their demise. The brutal conflict ignited instantly, though there was no flesh flying. Shards of bone scattered like confetti. Heads of skeletons were severed, and limbs were shattered with relentless ferocity. Absorbing soulfire requires time. It is not as simple as shoving the spoils into one's mouth and expecting instant gratification. To absorb downgraded soulfire may take mere seconds, while absorbing soulfire of the same tier could consume several hours or even days. When attempting to absorb soulfire from a higher tier, the process becomes exceedingly protracted. It is akin to pouring water into a bottle while simultaneously enlarging its volume. Naturally, the absorption rate cannot keep pace. Thus, despite the fact that these skeletons have successfully advanced, their true prowess remains that of subpar second-tier entities. From his position at the rear, Gu Erdan continued to command his skeletons to encircle the enemy, orchestrating a coordinated assault where a dozen minions converged on a single foe, rapidly inflicting severe damage. While directing the onslaught, he meticulously observed until, after several tense seconds, he finally identified his target. That one, the one with the horn protruding from its head. Not a green onion, but a horn. That is the one who seized my third-tier soulfire. Bring him down. Retrieve what is rightfully mine. At this moment, Gu Erdan remained infatuated with his recent spoils, particularly that orb of the highest quality, ghost fire from the skeletal sorcerer. His desire was primarily fueled by envy of the sorcerer's spells. Should he fortuitously acquire the resurrection incantation of skeletons, combined with his own skeletal lord system, Gu Erdan would surely soar to greatness. As he issued his commands, the skeletal soldiers began to converge upon the formidable foe. This individual, having claimed the finest treasures, was undoubtedly formidable in strength. One could only speculate about his race and life. He was impressively tall, with a skeletal frame exceeding 2 meters in height, and his robustness was quite extraordinary, with arm bones as thick as the thigh bones of others. Armed with a massive bone axe and clad in bone armor conjured by a spell, he resembled a veritable war machine. The advancing skeletons were swiftly felled by a single sweep of his weapon. Alas, while his destructive power was abundant, his speed was lacking. Once a few skeletal soldiers ensnared him with their long spears and forcibly immobilized him, his skeletal existence was abruptly concluded. With a resounding crack, the head of the horned skeleton was severed. One of the skeletal soldiers, bending to retrieve the head, directly extracted the ghost fire from its eye socket. But rather than surrender the prize, he stood transfixed, cradling the ghost fire. Clearly, he was succumbing to the overwhelming temptation. However, Gu Erdan did not afford him the chance to rebel. He rushed over, seized the ghost fire, and delivered a swift strike upon the soldier's skull. "Get back to work," he commanded in a tone reminiscent of a ruthless capitalist, causing the unfortunate skeletal figure to tremble and hurriedly grasp his weapon, rushing back into the fray. Meanwhile, Gu Erdan held aloft the product of the fusion between the second-tier skeletal soldier and the skeletal sorcerer's ghost fire, grinning foolishly. Without a moment's hesitation, Gu Erdan grasped the ghost fire, lifted his breastplate, and inserted it within. In the next instant, he trembled uncontrollably as the ghost fire within his chest surged forth, with tendrils of green spiritual flame erupting from the crevices of his armor. At that moment, a rhythmic melody resonated in his mind. "This big bowl of fire is electrifying. Wow, it's even causing me to emit electronic sounds." This substance was indeed a third-tier ghost fire, powerful. Having never consumed such a potent flame before, Gu Erdan was overwhelmed with exhilaration. Meanwhile, the traitorous skeletons engaged in battle around him abruptly turned in unison, their pale green ghost fires locking onto Gu Erdan's form. A mere first-tier skeleton soldier had obtained something he had no right to touch. "Kill!" they howled. The cacophony of their cries echoed as several second-tier skeletons disregarded the surrounding enemies and charged madly toward Gu Erdan. Caught off guard by this unforeseen turn of events, Gu Erdan felt a surge of panic. He frantically commanded his minions to intercept, while hastily retreating to create distance. Most of the skeletal soldiers were successfully halted. After all, no matter how valiant they were, even a fierce tiger could not withstand a pack of wolves. Yet, this was merely the majority. Let us not forget that when the undead ascend, they acquire an array of arcane necromantic spells. Among these are some rather obscure incantations. Just as Gu Erdan drew a breath, a resounding explosion echoed beneath him. The ground erupted, and a two-tiered skeleton, marred with countless gashes, abruptly emerged, lunging forward with its gaping maw aimed directly at Gu Erdan's ankle. This was the second-tier necromantic spell, Hell's Infiltration. It allows one to traverse through low-density matter with an almost ethereal grace. In a moment of sheer surprise, Gu Erdan instinctively delivered a powerful kick, forcibly sending the assailant back into the chaotic sea of bones. Having completed this act, Gu Erdan, now fully aware, dared not linger and swiftly turned to flee, all the while calling for reinforcements. However, he overlooked a crucial detail. If he did not provide precise instructions, these mindless skeleton soldiers would not comprehend the concept of caution. With a swift whoosh, 5 skeletal rib arrows shot through the air, striking with precision beside Gu Erdan and burying themselves deep into the bone-laden ground. The next instant, amidst Gu Erdan's horrified expression, a deafening explosion erupted. Chapter 12. The dash beneath the dusk. Are you lot attempting a rebellion? Do you wish to eliminate me as well? Gu Erdan, having hurriedly thrown himself to the ground to evade the shrapnel, turned and shouted in fury. To his dismay, the very skeleton warriors that had aimed to assist him were now felled by the onslaught, either mutilated or rendered lifeless. Worse yet, although the burrowing skeletal warrior had also been caught in the blast and was a primary target, it survived due to its concealed position underground and the reinforcement of its second-tier skeletal structure. It sustained injuries, but was far from dead, quickly crawling back towards Gu Erdan. The rain of arrows had not only failed to eliminate the target, but had also disrupted the impending rescue, leaving Gu Erdan in a state of despair. He could scarcely contain his frustration. He yearned to sever the heads of those skeleton soldiers and launch them like arrows. Yet, it was too late for any action. As the skeletal warrior crawled towards him like a bizarre creature, Gu Erdan hastily rose and fled. Gu Erdan sprinted ahead, pursued by the skeletal warrior, with a horde of clawing skeletons trailing behind. Underneath the setting sun, these 3 parties engaged in an arduous marathon. Skeletons do not tire, indeed. Most undead have no concept of fatigue, for they are, after all, deceased. Have you ever heard of the dead growing weary? Thus, those in flight found themselves in a most awkward predicament. Gu Erdan dared not halt, fearing that if he paused, his fragile form would be easily crushed by his relentless pursuers. Meanwhile, the skeletal warrior continued its relentless chase, driven by an unwavering determination. As for the skeletal minions trailing behind, they were relentless. The archers among them even attempted to shoot arrows. However, after Gu Erdan nearly met his demise from a volley of arrows that had woefully lost their mark, he dared not allow these lunatics to attack again. Were they aiding him or hindering him? It felt as though this band was more terrifying than the skeletal warrior at the rear. Could it be that they were plotting to eliminate him and usurp his position? Gu Erdan sprinted over 20 kilometers, weaving in circles, fearing that a straight path might lead him to formidable foes, and thus he only dared to linger in the familiar territory he knew well. As the dark sun in the sky gradually dimmed and the ground succumbed to darkness, Gu Erdan's pace finally slowed. This was not due to fatigue, but rather because he had finally conceived a plan to deal with the pursuing enemies. 15 miles ahead lay a chasm of bones. The flat bone plain inexplicably split open, revealing a narrow crevice flanked by lush vegetation. The ravenous ghost cry vines writhed and coiled, forming countless vine bridges above the fissure. With a bit of caution, one could traverse them. However, at that moment, Gu Erdan was certainly not intending to cross the bridges. He was poised to leap off the cliff, running at full speed. Just as the sky was on the verge of complete darkness, Gu Erdan finally reached the precipice. Without hesitation, he grasped a vine and leaped into the air. His lightweight frame, combined with the force of his leap, sent him soaring across to the other side. In the very next instant, a skeletal warrior, akin to a fish darting through the earth, burst forth from the ground, launching itself off the cliff. Though the intelligence of skeletons may be low, it does not imply they lack instinct. They understood the basics, such as climbing stairs and leaping off cliffs, grasping a vine with surprising skill. This skeletal warrior also propelled itself forward, clearly unwilling to let Gu Erdan escape unscathed. However, just as it was mid-leap, a fierce gust of wind surged, and the skeletal warrior was taken aback to see Gu Erdan returning. In a moment of shock, the skeletal warrior brushed past Gu Erdan, who, in passing, cheekily raised his middle finger in defiance. Mad as hell. Haha. This was Gu Erdan's plan. He never needed to completely shake off his pursuers. All he required was to elude them for a moment. Even a mere second was sufficient, as long as he could rejoin his skeletal comrades. A single skeletal warrior posed no threat whatsoever. Gazing at the pile of skeletal minions gathered at the edge of the cliff, Gu Erdan was overwhelmed with emotion, tears of joy welling in his eyes. Finally safe. Once he successfully reached the shore, if that scoundrel dared to pursue him again, he would have his minions dismantle him into 108 pieces. As Gu Erdan pondered how to deal with his adversaries, he finally reached the precipice with the aid of the vines. Suddenly, a resounding crash echoed as he collided headfirst into a row of skeletal minions, the skull hanging from his neck spinning twice in rapid succession. Bewildered, Gu Erdan widened his eyes in silent disbelief, exchanging glances with his minions, while his body, propelled by inertia, swung back. "You, great Lord!" A wretched cry escaped him, and after a prolonged silence, Gu Erdan finally grasped the situation. This band of fools had left him no room to maneuver. They must be intent on eliminating him, right? Why else would they consistently thwart him? Why would they dig pitfalls for him at every turn? You imbeciles! With a piercing scream, Gu Erdan swung towards the opposite side, and mid-flight, he once again brushed past the relentless skeletal warrior. In that fleeting moment, Gu Erdan distinctly perceived the confusion in the warrior's eyes. He seemed unable to fathom why Gu Erdan had returned. In truth, Gu Erdan was equally perplexed, uncertain of why he found himself back here. Turning to gaze at the ever-approaching edge of the cliff, he sighed and prepared to leap forward. However, to his astonishment, despite stretching his foot as far as he could, he still found himself a hand's breadth away from the cliff's edge. Though the distance was minimal, that short span became the final straw for Gu Erdan. "I can't reach it," he wailed, and with a desperate cry, the vines released their last ounce of strength, sending him swinging back towards the opposite side, still bearing the visage of despair. On his third swing, predictably, he brushed past the skeletal warrior once more. Then came the fourth, fifth, and sixth swings. The two figures now devoid of any leverage, the vines shaking diminishing with each pass until they finally ceased entirely. With a sharp crack, the two individuals, clinging to the vines, collided violently at the center of the cliff. As Gu Erdan looked up at the skeletal warrior peering down at him, a chilling sensation coursed through him. He attempted to speak, yet the skull hanging from his neck emitted a crack, and his jaw fell loose. "Quite the coincidence, huh? Ha ha. Have you eaten? Ah." The skeletal warrior had indeed not dined, nor did he wish to. He was solely intent on feasting on Gu Erdan. With a ferocious snap of his fangs, he sank his teeth into Gu Erdan's skull, producing a sickening crunch. Poor Gu Erdan's crown could not withstand such brutality, resulting in a gaping hole that elicited a series of horrified screams from him. Just as the skeletal warrior prepared to pursue his advantage, a sudden howling wind echoed from afar. Upon hearing the commotion, the skeletal warrior halted his assault and quickly looked up, only to witness a throng of skeletal soldiers grasping vines as they swung towards them. With a resounding thud and a cacophony, dozens of skeletal soldiers surged forth, passing by the two figures. Without a moment's hesitation, the tendrils released and leapt forward. Their courage was commendable, their resolve unwavering, their determination steadfast. Alas, their intellect fell short. Numerous skeletal warriors miscalculated their distance, soaring past the two, only to plummet straight downwards. A few skeletal warriors did manage to strike, yet not against the two, but were instead kicked aside by the bone warrior. A cacophony ensued, and when the clamor ceased, the hard-earned wealth of Gu Erdan, accumulated over half a month, had dwindled from over 60 to a mere handful, all dangling beneath the tendrils of the two. Chapter 13. A war of love and hatred. Gu Erdan observed the bone warrior desperately kicking, attempting to send the skeletal warriors below tumbling down, and a spark ignited in his eyes. Stealthily, he began to ascend, gradually surpassing the opposing bone warrior. Upon realizing that the bone warrior had sensed his subtle movements, Gu Erdan suddenly accelerated upwards. He intended to scale the vine bridge and sever the tendril, allowing this mad dog to experience the thrill of free-fall bungee jumping. As for the little brothers hanging from that tendril, they would simply have to fend for themselves. Gu Erdan climbed swiftly. After all, the skeletal frame was exceedingly light. His movements were naturally unimpeded during the ascent. Noticing his ascent, the bone warrior also began to scramble upwards with fervor, displaying a surprising level of intellect. After being thwarted twice by the skeletal warriors below, this creature abruptly tore off its own rib, directly severing the tendril below. The skeletal warriors clinging to that tendril emitted a series of cracking sounds as they plummeted towards the abyss. Climb, climb with all their might. Gu Erdan and the skeletal warrior began a fierce contest. However, Gu Erdan held a significant advantage due to his initial lead and was poised to reach the summit first. Witnessing the two ascend, Gu Erdan's little brothers beneath the tendril began to follow suit, the sound of cracking resonating continuously. As they climbed, Gu Erdan suddenly sensed something amiss. He glanced down at the little brothers below and then at the trembling tendril in his grasp. After a moment of silence, he suddenly let out a fierce roar. "What are you all doing climbing? What if the tendril breaks? You fools! A mere tendril could hardly withstand such strain." The combined force of nearly 10 skeletal warriors climbing together had begun to strain the tendril to its breaking point. The creaking noises from above served as irrefutable proof. In a flurry, Gu Erdan halted his movements, signaling the little brothers below to cease as well, lest they all meet their demise together if the tendril were to snap. However, while they remained still, the bone warrior opposite did not pause. With excitement, it employed all four limbs to swiftly leap over Gu Erdan and ascend. After only a few meters of escape, the creature crawled back on all fours. Gu Erdan and the skeletal warrior found themselves once again on the same level, staring at the motionless Gu Erdan. Without a moment's hesitation, the skeletal warrior grasped a vine with one hand and reached fiercely towards Gu Erdan's chest with the other, attempting to extract the soul fire within. Realizing his life was in imminent danger, Gu Erdan, despite his fear, had no choice but to retaliate. The two combatants swung their arms relentlessly, creating a cacophony in the air, yet neither could gain the upper hand due to their lack of strength. Perhaps even the heavens could not bear to witness this farce any longer, and they finally intervened to put an end to the chaos. With a resounding crack, the vine in Gu Erdan's hand ultimately snapped under the strain. His body lost balance and began to plummet downward. Unlike the foolish skeletal soldiers, Gu Erdan possessed intelligence, and above all, a profound fear of death. His instinct for survival surged within him, unleashing unprecedented potential in this critical moment. With a loud thud, Gu Erdan, as he fell, managed to grasp one of the skeletal warrior's legs, entangling himself with all four limbs. The skeletal warrior, taken aback by the unexpected attachment, soon became ferocious, raising a hand to strike at Gu Erdan's head. However, before his hand could descend, Gu Erdan acted first. He yanked off his own head and hurled it toward the warrior. With a resounding impact, the skeletal warrior's head was sent reeling, its eyes ablaze with soul fire. Clearly consumed by rage, how dare a mere first-tier minion defy him so boldly? Roaring in fury, the skeletal warrior prepared to rip Gu Erdan apart. Yet, at that moment, a sharp crack resonated from above the vine in his hand. The familiar sound froze both Gu Erdan and the skeletal warrior in place. They both raised their heads to discover that the vine was nearly severed, silently retreating their gazes. They shared a moment of tense stillness before Gu Erdan began to tremble his legs desperately, while the skeletal warrior kicked wildly, attempting to dislodge Gu Erdan. What did he care for soul fire? His life was at stake. This second-tier skeletal warrior clearly possessed enhanced intelligence and understood the importance of survival. Gu Erdan, swinging like a candle in the wind, clung tightly to the warrior's waist, his soul fire paling in fear. Please, brother, for the sake of our kin, lend me a hand. With desperate kicks above and a firm grip below, the two became entangled, unable to extricate themselves. As their struggle intensified, the vine began to fray at an alarming rate, teetering on the brink of collapse. After all, it is often said that the undead are truly formidable beings. As he realized he was about to be dragged into the abyss by this fiend, the skeletal warrior exerted himself with a sudden force, severing his own thigh. Accompanied by the detachment of his left leg, the anguished cries of Gu Erdan echoed as he plummeted into the unfathomable chasm below, leaving only a wailing lament in his wake. For the sake of the party and the nation, brothers, lend me a hand. The skeletal warrior, dangling from the vine, finally exhaled in relief as the immediate peril seemed to dissipate. However, at that moment, a sharp crack resonated from above, followed by a scream of despair. With a frantic grip on the severed vine, the skeletal warrior too tumbled into the abyss, leaving behind only a fragment of the vine swaying in the breeze beneath the vine bridge. Gu Erdan, the skeletal warrior, and over 60 skeletal minions all plunged into the ravine, with none escaping their fate. The torrential waters lashed against the shore, and the dark river was strewn with the remnants of bones. Another wave surged forth, casting a multitude of bone fragments onto the beach, merging them into the endless shore of remains. Yet this time was distinct. Along with the numerous shattered bones, several half-formed skeletal frames were also washed ashore. As the river receded, amidst the debris, a severely damaged skeletal hand suddenly rose. The 4 fingers above gradually closed, leaving only the thumb standing defiantly. I'm still alive. Cough. Gu Erdan's voice emerged, though he was left with but a half-body. Not only had his legs and pelvis vanished, but his right arm was also nowhere to be found. Describing his state as tragic would be an understatement. Lacking both legs, an arm, and previously a head, this creature had somehow been reduced to a single limb. Despite the gruesome appearance, Gu Erdan felt an inexplicable joy. He had survived. He had emerged unscathed from the perilous plunge. This was all thanks to his uniqueness. While his minions met a gruesome fate upon crashing into the sea, their bodies shattered upon impact, particularly their heads, which were obliterated. Without a vessel to contain them, their souls dissipated, and they perished instantly. Only Gu Erdan was different, for he lacked a head. Thus, he would not succumb so easily. As long as his sternum remained intact, he could cling to life. Chapter 14. Ascension to Skeletal Guardian. Regardless of the circumstances, surviving was a boon, even if it meant all his minions perished. The path to greatness is indeed as ironclad as it seems. Now, I shall stride forth anew. At worst, I can start over, with the sole remaining arm. He excitedly pounded the ground, struggling to rise and mend his injuries. However, as he turned, an unexpected sight confronted him. It was a head, a severely mangled skull, its crown shattered beyond recognition. Moreover, this skull appeared intent on biting him. Alas, with most of its upper and lower teeth scattered, though it had the desire to bite, it lacked the power to do so. Gazing at the ferocious skeleton head lunging toward him with a fierce desire to bite, Gu Erdan took a moment to identify the creature. Ah, is that not the skeletal warrior, my old acquaintance? It seems you've been reduced to nothing but a head. Observing his adversary's pitiful state, Gu Erdan couldn't contain his delight. With his remaining arm, he struck the skeleton, only to have 2 of his fingers bitten off in return. How audacious! Even in such a state, you still wish to bite me? Very well. You shall pay for this. With a swift motion, he sent the skull flying and struggled to sit up, scavenging a few bones to begin a remarkably adept reconstruction. Piece by piece, the bones interlocked, and in less than 10 minutes, a brand new Gu Erdan was born. Utilizing the bone regeneration technique, he reconstructed his body and, while stretching to regain his mobility, approached the skull of the skeletal warrior. Cradling the skull in his hands, he chuckled at its relentless desire to bite him, and, much to his amusement, he affixed it to his own neck, adopting it as his new head. Come, let me show you how I achieve prosperity. With excitement coursing through his veins, Gu Erdan felt an overwhelming sense of joy. Though his subordinates had all perished in battle, it seemed as if he had returned to the moment of his own resurrection. Yet, one must not forget that Gu Erdan was no longer the same. Within him resided a third-tier soul flame. If he could successfully devour it, he would undoubtedly ascend to become a second-tier skeleton soldier. At that point, recruiting first-tier skeletons would be as effortless as child's play, upgrading them to the second tier. He could lead a band of 100 or so to encircle and vanquish third-tier foes. Subsequently, devouring the third-tier soul flame would further elevate his power. This cyclical enhancement would allow Gu Erdan's strength to burgeon exponentially. After all, while others toil for decades or even centuries to cultivate elites, Gu Erdan's prowess did not hinge upon the talents of his subordinates, but rather on his own strength. If he were a deity with sufficient energy, he could effortlessly forge an entire divine legion. This was a precautionary measure, were he to disregard the loyalty of his followers and focus solely on enhancement. With abundant energy at his disposal, Gu Erdan could manifest a deity at this very moment. Balancing the skull of his foe atop his neck, Gu Erdan, now a patchwork of assorted bones, began to meticulously survey his surroundings. Perhaps due to their proximity to the river, the number of skeleton soldiers here was woefully scant. A mere handful could be spotted at a glance. Yet, this suited Gu Erdan's intentions perfectly, for his primary objective was not to recruit followers, but to fortify himself. In this context, the fewer skeleton soldiers around, the better. Finding a favorable location imbued with auspicious feng shui, Gu Erdan excavated a pit, burrowing directly into the bone wall to create a shelter for himself. He cautiously reclined within, swiftly sealing the entrance behind him. In the blink of an eye, the once lively skeleton warrior, Gu Erdan, had seamlessly merged with the wall. This concealment lasted a full 7 days. During this time, Gu Erdan harnessed the power of ghostly flames to refine his bones and cleanse his soul, ultimately transcending the realm of a first-tier skeleton soldier, evolving into the legendary second-tier cannon fodder. Gazing at his bone structure, as exquisite as jade, Gu Erdan felt an overwhelming surge of excitement. Had he possessed a head, tears of joy would surely have flowed. It had been a challenging journey, nearly 4 months in this world. At last, he was no longer a fragile being that shattered at a mere touch. Now, he had transformed into a resilient entity that only fractured under significant pressure. Name: Gu Erdan. Host: identity, second-tier skeleton guardian, low rank, skills, first-tier necromancy, bone regeneration, second-tier necromancy, basic bone reinforcement, passive, description, congratulations. You have successfully evolved into an elite creature. Upon examining his attributes, Gu Erdan let out a sigh of mild discontent. The randomly acquired second-tier spell was not up to par. Although the bone reinforcement was a passive spell, permanently enhancing his physical form and providing decent survival capabilities, it paled in comparison to the pinnacle of second-tier necromantic spells or even the finest first-tier spells. Spells such as the renowned skeleton resurrection, corpse transformation, and poison witchcraft evoked a spine-chilling dread. Compared to these, the basic bone reinforcement he had grasped felt utterly trivial. However, whispers spoke of advanced versions of this spell, such as intermediate and advanced bone reinforcement. The legendary death goddess bone was said to possess a hardness comparable to that of divine beings, representing the apex of skeletal prowess. Regrettably, such fabled abilities, including the death goddess bone itself, were seldom acquired by skeletons. Otherwise, they would not remain mere legends. After all, innate spells were randomly bestowed, and without the favor of Lady Luck, how could one expect to win the lottery, let alone secure an entire set? Knocking on his own bones, Gu Erdan nodded in satisfaction. His bones, enhanced by the basic bone reinforcement, now boasted a hardness akin to stone and steel, significantly augmenting his survival capabilities. Gu Erdan firmly believed that survival was paramount. After all, it mattered not how brightly one could smile, but rather how long one could continue to smile. Only those who laughed until the end could be deemed victors, a sentiment that resonated deeply with him. Now, as a skeleton soldier, immortal and ageless, he resolved that if he could not outfight his opponents, he could certainly outlast them. He would stack his defenses, fortifying his armor to its utmost thickness, while his minions delivered the most venomous strikes upon their foes. The system, after all, offers no assistance in one's growth. What then can one hope to achieve? Cursed be it. After finally consuming the soul fire of the ancient spirit, Gu Erdan forcefully kicked through the skeletal wall and emerged from the pit he had dug for himself. However, upon surveying the situation outside, Gu Erdan silently turned back, returning to his small pit, where he collected the woven bones and resealed the entrance. For outside, what should have been a sparse number of skeletal soldiers had inexplicably multiplied to an overwhelming extent. Moreover, these creatures were engaged in fierce combat, fighting with reckless abandon. Among them were numerous second-tier skeletal soldiers. What in the world was happening? Chapter 15. An unusual skeletal soldier sitting in his pit. Gu Erdan wore a look of bewilderment, unable to fathom how such a seismic shift could occur in merely 7 days. Had a horde of skeletal soldiers embarked on a mass migration, inadvertently arriving here? Or was there a skeletal sorcerer, perhaps in a fit of madness, resurrecting skeletal soldiers en masse? Yet, even so, such a spectacle seemed implausible. A mere glance revealed skeletal soldiers as far as the eye could see. There must be at least 10 or 18,000 of them. If these were indeed resurrected by a skeletal sorcerer, he would have to labor tirelessly for days without rest. There was something amiss. Absolutely something amiss. Cowering within his pit, Gu Erdan was filled with a desire to slap himself twice. To be precise, he had already done so. And with considerable force, for the head above was not his own. Striking an enemy's head brings no pain to the heart, only to the hand. Had he known, he would not have wasted so much. He should have absorbed it gradually. With a resigned sigh, Gu Erdan felt a tinge of regret. The reason he could swiftly absorb a third-tier soul fire as a first-tier skeletal soldier was not due to any extraordinary talent, but rather because this fellow absorbed it with reckless abandon, ignoring excessive consumption, disregarding energy overflow. Gu Erdan pursued speed relentlessly, unconcerned with the potential wastage of the soul fire's power. Otherwise, how could he have barely reached second tier after completely devouring a third-tier soul fire? Even if he did not attain the pinnacle of second tier, he should not have been at the bottom. Originally, Gu Erdan's plan was to sacrifice minor gains for greater ones, swiftly amassing initial resources to become a second-tier skeletal soldier, then venture forth to recruit first-tier skeletal soldiers and strengthen them. Once he gathered enough, he would lead his enhanced subordinates to hunt high-level foes, thereby expanding his influence in a snowball effect. Yet, who could have anticipated that upon awakening, the outside world had transformed entirely? Thousands upon thousands of skeletal soldiers. Who knows how many second-tier ones might emerge from this? If misfortune were to bring forth a few third-tier skeletal soldiers, would Gu Erdan not be doomed? While Gu Erdan was lost in these frantic thoughts, the skeletal wall he used for concealment suddenly creaked, and two bone spears breached the barrier, piercing into Gu Erdan's chest armor. The once dilapidated and severely rusted breastplate, possessing almost negligible defensive capabilities, crumbled at the slightest touch of the corroded iron plate, allowing the formidable bone spear to pierce through effortlessly. However, the impressive might of the bone spear met its end there. When it struck against the ribs of Gu Erdan, the spearhead was immediately shattered, posing no threat whatsoever to him. The sudden onslaught startled Gu Erdan, who let out a startled cry and seized the two bone spears, propelling himself from his concealed position with great force. Who dares disturb the peace here? He bellowed, with sheer strength snapping the brittle spears in half, clutching the broken weapons. He wasted no time in thrusting them forward. With a sharp crack, the descending fragments pierced the skulls of his adversaries, swiftly dispatching the two first-tier skeleton soldiers. Having dealt with his foes, Gu Erdan cast aside the lifeless bodies, taking a deep breath to draw in their scattered soul flames. Who else dares to defy me? Come forth. With a sweeping gaze, he noted that all surrounding skeletons were of the first tier, which bolstered his courage. Gripping his dual weapons, he let out a fierce roar. In the next moment, hundreds of first-tier skeleton soldiers surged towards him with ferocity. Startled, Gu Erdan's legs weakened, and he hastily retreated to his hidden refuge. Countless skeletons crowded the entrance, each unwilling to yield, all eager to strike him down. This scenario played to Gu Erdan's advantage. Seeing his enemies immobilized, he raised his broken spears and began to stab fiercely, causing skeletons to collapse one after another. The pile of bones at the entrance growing ever higher. Just as Gu Erdan believed he had discovered a strategic loophole, the walls beside him trembled violently, followed by a thunderous crash as a multitude of skulls burst forth, nearly prompting him to discard his weapons in fright. The onslaught commenced. The first-tier skeletons, having broken through the bony wall, mercilessly besieged Gu Erdan. Initially overwhelmed with fear, he soon realized something remarkable. These assailants could not harm him. The effects of the low-tier skeletal enhancement were strikingly effective. Although he struggled against steel weapons, against these fragile bone-made arms, he was utterly dominant. They could not cleave him. They could not batter him. They could not break him. After enduring numerous blows, Gu Erdan finally recognized his advantage. Perhaps against well-equipped humans or equally matched undead, his ability might seem somewhat lackluster. However, when faced with these feeble opponents, it was nothing short of a dominant weapon. With newfound resolve swelling within him, Gu Erdan charged into the throng of bones, his weapons swinging with abandon, embodying the formidable spirit of Zhao Zilong of Changshan. However, while Zhao Zilong could venture in and out 7 times unscathed, Gu Erdan found himself rolling and crawling, sustaining blows along the way. Despite his initial frenzy, Gu Erdan had not completely lost his senses. Amidst the chaos of battle, he remained observant of his surroundings. Wherever there were second-tier skeleton soldiers, he would not dare approach, fearing he might be overpowered. As he dispatched these feeble skeletons, he also endeavored to recruit them. Generally speaking, as long as one's strength surpassed that of the adversary and placed them in a perilous situation, recruiting such beings as skeletons was almost guaranteed. The caveat being that one must also be an undead creature, capable of emanating a necromantic aura that they could perceive. However, for reasons unknown today, the skeletons here exhibited an unusual ferocity. Regardless of Gu Erdan's attempts at invitation or intimidation, they showed no mercy, presenting an attitude of either you kill me, or I kill you. With their frenzied spirits and erratic attacks, compounded by an alarming increase in their numbers, these skeletons appeared distinctly abnormal. Just as Gu Erdan was fiercely battling the skeletons and striving to recruit them, a shrill sound of a flute echoed from afar. In the next moment, the skeleton soldiers, who were previously engaged in a fierce struggle, abruptly ceased their actions, turning in unison towards the direction of the sound. Seizing the opportunity, Gu Erdan managed to fell several more skeletons and let out a sigh of relief. He had now confirmed that this place was undoubtedly peculiar. As the skeletons fought desperately, their numbers dwindled rapidly, yet their quality continued to rise. Many of the skeletons surrounding Gu Erdan had reached the pinnacle of the first tier, fully capable of injuring his bones. Were it not for their relatively small numbers, Gu Erdan would have fled long ago. Listening to the distant sound resembling a military horn and observing the now still, non-violent skeletons, a look of realization crossed Gu Erdan's face. He understood. The reason for the abnormality here, the sudden appearance of so many skeletons, was likely due to a powerful entity transforming this place into a training ground. Was he creating high-quality skeletons? What was his intent? Did he plan to recruit an army? Chapter 16, City of the Black Knights. The resounding call of the military horn continued to echo. Due to his limited vantage point, Gu Erdan craned his neck for a considerable time, but could not discern what transpired in the distance. The skeleton head he was wearing should have seen something. But what good would that do him? Suddenly, as the military horn fell silent, Gu Erdan noticed the skeletons, who had been fighting tooth and nail moments ago, begin to march in unison towards the direction of the horn. Bewildered, Gu Erdan had no choice but to follow the crowd forward. Otherwise, with everyone else advancing, his contrary movement would surely raise suspicions. There were nearly 1,000 remaining skeletons, armed with various weapons, marching along the riverbank. One could say these skeletons were prime targets among their ranks. After several days of perilous combat, the souls within them had amassed an immense reservoir of ghostly energy. Yet they had not yet had the opportunity to assimilate it. This band of miscreants was undoubtedly a substantial boon. Akin to canned meat, one could consume one and sustain oneself for an entire day without spending a single coin. As the procession continued, Gu Erdan found himself lagging behind, ultimately maneuvering his way to the rear of the group. He had firmly resolved that, should circumstances take a turn for the worse, he would either flee at once or dig himself a grave to bury his troubles. In any case, his guiding principle was one of survival. After all, he had already become a skeleton, and time was an inexhaustible resource. There was no need to rush towards growth. Opportunities for wealth amidst danger were better left for others. Gu Erdan preferred to seek fortune in leisure. As the main force traversed the end of the gorge, Gu Erdan finally discerned what lay beyond the chasm below. To his astonishment, he beheld a city constructed from black skeletal remains. To call it a city was perhaps an exaggeration. It resembled more of a medieval fortress from the west. A river meandered through the fortress, spilling out into the expanse beyond, eventually bifurcating into a moat of dark water. Towering before the moat was a magnificent wall, nearly 10 meters in height. From his vantage point within the city, Gu Erdan could clearly observe the black-armored soldiers stationed upon the battlements, interspersed with numerous skeletal warriors. Inside the walls, there were no orderly houses. Instead, a series of concentric smaller walls formed a military bastion devoid of any residential structures or villagers. The 7 walls, each progressively lower than the last, were spaced more than 100 meters apart. The inner walls, while significantly shorter than the outer 10-meter wall, stood at a mere 3 meters. Nevertheless, the terrain was unique. As the entire fortress was terraced, the interior was elevated above the exterior, effectively creating a strategic advantage that rendered any breach of the outer wall a negligible concern. Upon passing through a gate and emerging from the gorge, Gu Erdan and his companions found themselves within the innermost wall, the most fortified area and the stronghold of this citadel. Yet, the atmosphere here was far from pleasant. Injured soldiers were strewn about. Dismembered skeletal warriors lay discarded, awaiting the slow absorption of death's essence to mend their wounds. In the central area, a multitude of black-armored warriors congregated, clad in polished ebony armor, their gear remarkably well-crafted, complete with arm guards, greaves, helmets, and even a skirt of armor to fortify their vital defenses. The uniformity of their equipment, accentuated by a large crimson rose emblazoned upon their chests, set these black armored soldiers apart from the skeletal ranks. It was only upon entering the city that Gu Erdan understood who was leading the way ahead. The guide, a soldier clad in black armor, led a small contingent of 10. One individual brandished a colossal horn, while several others stood guard with their weapons drawn. At the forefront, one figure held aloft a flag that towered over 3 meters. Adorned with a crimson rose motif, the flag also bore a string of skulls at its apex, each skull flickering with a ghastly green flame. Gazing at the spectral fires above the flag, Gu Erdan swallowed nervously. 12 third-tier ghostly flames. 5 fourth-tier flames. Where on earth had he stumbled into? They were using 4th-tier ghostly flames as bait to lure the skeletons obediently along. Just how formidable must the entities here be? 5th tier? Or even 6th tier? Gu Erdan recalled having read that 6th tier undead could be deemed high-tier undead. Not only did their intelligence rival that of humans, but their prowess was also fearsome. Coupled with the vast number of skeleton soldiers and black-armored warriors within the city, had Gu Erdan inadvertently wandered into the territory of some necromancer lord? A multitude of skeleton soldiers continued to mindlessly pursue the ghostly flames, unhesitatingly entering the city. Once they had all crossed the threshold, a skull, cracked and weathered, peeked cautiously around the corner near the canyon-facing city gate. Its jaw clacked violently, as if in a fit of rage. The skull, spinning in a complete circle to ensure the area was secure, was finally approached by Gu Erdan, who cautiously emerged from his concealment. It seemed safe for the moment. With careful scrutiny, Gu Erdan confirmed that the soldiers stationed at the gate showed no signs of aggression. He then reattached the skull to his neck, stealthily slipping into the city. Simultaneously, he took the opportunity to assess the black-armored soldiers nearby using his system. Name, Black Warrior Identity, 3rd tier Undead, Intermediate, Skills, 1st tier Undead Spell, Armor of Resentment, 2nd tier Undead Spell, Death Spear, 3rd tier Undead Spell, Deathly Self-Detonation Description, a lunatic. He may lose, but you can hardly claim victory. Observing the attributes of this formidable companion, Gu Erdan discreetly distanced himself. A self-destructing foe. Best to tread carefully. Following closely behind the last skeleton, Gu Erdan's mood darkened as he continued his observations. Something was amiss. Very much amiss. The Black Warriors were 3rd tier undead. To be among their ranks, one must possess at least 3rd tier strength. While this was not particularly unusual, the sheer number of Black Warriors present was quite extraordinary. A quick glance around revealed that, although skeleton soldiers dominated the population, the number of Black Warriors was likely around 1,000. Did not these creatures prefer to operate in small groups? Typically, they would cluster in tens, coordinating to hunt their prey. Why then, were there regimented formations of Black Warriors here? Especially considering their abilities. Their 1st tier and 2nd tier spells were astonishingly identical, designed to corrode armor, transforming it into the special equipment known as Armor of Resentment, and to morph into Spears of Modification, and amplifying its power, the Death Javelin. Behold this assembly of dark warriors. Not only do their armors exhibit a uniform design, adorned with intricate patterns upon their chests, but each of them also bears 4 javelins upon their backs, holding a shield in one hand and a spear in the other. This is undoubtedly the epitome of a regular army. To muster such a formidable number of dark warriors, all possessing remarkably similar innate abilities, Ancient Erdan felt a surge of excitement within. Before he could confirm his suspicions, a sudden commotion erupted among the skeletal soldiers in the distance. Moments later, the city gates swung open, and dozens of dark warriors surged forth. Leading the charge was a figure clad in black armor, distinguishable by a blood-red cape flowing behind him. Chapter 17. The King of Dark Warriors pushing aside a few bothersome skeletal soldiers, Erdan peered intently. As he discerned the figure's appearance and checked its attributes through the system, he felt an almost uncontrollable urge to scream in excitement. It was a king, the King of Dark Warriors. His conjecture had proven accurate. Indeed, there was a king. The term king refers to the sovereign among a race. For instance, the King of Dark Warriors, the King of Terrifying Knights, the King of Headless Riders, the King of Lich. Each undead race possesses its own innate ruler. As for the skeletal soldiers, their leader does not bear the title of king, but is referred to as the skeletal sorcerer, the one capable of resurrecting skeletal soldiers. At this juncture, it is evident what powers a king possesses. Indeed, they can create their kin. Name: King of Dark Warriors, Clander Sulla. Identity: 5th tier Dark Warrior, Elite. Skills: 1st ring Necromancy Spell, Armor of Resentment. 2nd ring Necromancy Spell, Death Javelin. 3rd ring Necromancy Spell, Dark Warrior Resurrection Technique. 4th ring Necromancy Spell, Hand of Soul Snatching. 5th ring Necromancy Spell, Soul Shockwave. Description: a born king of dark warriors. No one can shake his position among them. Gazing at the attributes of the king of dark warriors, Erdan felt his heartbeat accelerate wildly. A true powerhouse. Unlike the skeletal sorcerer who can merely resurrect first-tier skeletal soldiers as cannon fodder, this figure before him possesses the ability to resurrect dark warriors. As long as a suitable corpse is crafted and a sufficient amount of souls is gathered, this being can instantly produce a dark warrior. The identical first and second ring spells serve as a hallmark of the resurrected dark warriors. The third ring spell, however, varies by individual. For instance, the elder brother who previously guarded the gate may have awakened such explosive abilities due to his fiery temperament, such majestic city walls, such noble status, and those impeccably uniform armors and patterns. Erdan would wager his life that this king of dark warriors is far from foolish. In fact, he is most likely exceptionally intelligent. After all, even a typical fifth-tier undead, if possessing intellect, could never construct such a flawlessly magnificent castle. With excitement coursing through him, Gu Erdan stood at the rear of the line, unable to suppress his fantasies of infiltrating this formidable group and seizing the opportunity to recruit some black warriors. Just look at their obsidian armor. Their imposing forms radiate an air of elite prowess. In stark contrast, he surveyed the skeletal figures beside him. Adorned with a hodgepodge of weaponry and lamentably frail physiques, to call them mere rabble would be an overstatement. If he could somehow acquire a few black warriors as bodyguards, his ascent would be instantaneous. As Gu Erdan indulged in his daydreams, he pushed through the ranks of skeletal soldiers, desperately maneuvering forward. The king of black warriors had gathered the skeletons here with purpose. It was clear he sought to replenish his ranks after a fierce battle, as evidenced by the wounded scattered throughout the city. Moreover, the omnipresence of skeletal soldiers atop the walls indicated that the enemy was not a compulsive collector, solely recruiting black warriors as subordinates. He showed no reluctance in utilizing the readily producible and inexpensive skeletons to bolster his forces. And it could be inferred that these skeletons held a certain status within his army. Given Gu Erdan's current second-tier status, his clever intellect, and his regenerative ability of the skeletal resurrection, he believed he could secure a position within this formidable army. As for whether the king would demand a fragment of his soul, that was preposterous. With thousands of third-tier experts at his command, would he truly seek the soul fragment of a mere second-tier pawn? Furthermore, if he desired it, so be it. After all, there was a flickering essence of soul fire within his mind. He could relinquish as much as was needed. If it came to that, he could even offer his head, for it was not truly his anyway. Just as Gu Erdan was adjusting his armor, preparing to conceal the soul fire in his chest and boldly present himself, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. The king of black warriors, standing before the skeletal soldiers, uttered not a word of stirring rhetoric, nor did he intend to engage them in conversation. Instead, he raised his hand, and dark mist began to spread forth, coalescing into shadowy arms that plunged directly into the skulls of the skeletons before him. In the next moment, the soul fires of the skeletal soldiers were forcibly extracted. The deprived skeletons collapsed with a clatter, their frames disintegrating, clearly succumbing to their demise. Having retrieved the soul fires, the king of black warriors flicked his wrist, sending the captured essence spiraling toward the injured black warriors, leaving a trail of pale green light in its wake. As the power of the soul fires coursed into their bodies, the wounds of the black warriors rapidly healed, with some of the less grievously injured rising to their feet. Witnessing this spectacle, Gu Erdan stood frozen in shock, his mind reeling for several moments before he abruptly regained his senses. Good heavens! This fellow is not recruiting soldiers. He is harvesting their very essence. Where could he dare to advance? Gu Erdan suddenly grasped a nearby skeleton soldier, positioning it in front of himself, while he attempted to flee. However, it was easy to enter but difficult to exit. The horde of skeleton soldiers behind him were fixated on the enticing ghostly flames of the flag, their eyes wide in awe. Though deterred by the formidable presence of the Black Knight and the Black Knight King, none dared to approach. Yet, they were equally reluctant to retreat, pushing forward with unyielding determination. This predicament left Gu Erdan in a dire strait. He yearned to escape, but found himself utterly trapped. He urged the group forward, struggling to maintain momentum. If he exerted too little force, they would not budge. If he exerted too much, he risked drawing unwanted attention. But the alternative was unthinkable. Death awaited if he did not act. Just as Gu Erdan grappled with his dilemma, the sounds of skeletons collapsing echoed ahead. Waves of skeleton soldiers fell victim to the soul-siphoning grasp of the Black Knight King's four-ring spell, reduced once more to mere bone frames. The power of this technique was undeniably impressive. The Black Knight King reaped the energy of these expendable minions without lifting a finger, demonstrating a truly devastating prowess. The noise grew increasingly closer, and as the Black Knight King approached, Gu Erdan found himself unable to dislodge the relentless throng behind him. With a deep breath and resolve in his eyes, He declared to himself that he would fight back. With a resounding crack, another row of skeleton soldiers fell, revealing Gu Erdan and his companions. He hastily transferred the ghostly flame energy to his subordinates, enabling them to heal their wounds, as the Black Knight King strode towards them, poised to strike. Yet, just as the Black Knight King prepared to seize them, a sudden sharp sound erupted from the lined-up skeleton soldiers. One of them collapsed, its head rolling away to rest at the feet of the Black Knight King, staring at the motionless skeleton, devoid of life, and glancing at his own dormant powers. The Black Knight King appeared bewildered. When had his soul-siphoning grasp become so potent? Had he frightened a foe to death before even engaging? Chapter 18. My lord. Spare me. He kicked the skull that had rolled to his feet, gazing at the inert head, its mouth tightly shut and green ghostly flames flickering within its eye sockets. The Black Knight King remained perplexed, completely disregarding the headless corpse lying in the distance. This was precisely what Gu Erdan had hoped for. Indeed, this was his cunning plan, often referred to as sacrificing the pawn to protect the king. You desire the ghostly flames, do you not? Here is a head for you. Use it as you wish. As for the corpse, there were already countless skeletons strewn about. What difference would one more make? As long as he lay still, who could possibly guess he was alive? Although there were skeleton soldiers born without heads, those with a skull atop them as a disguise were nearly non-existent. Ordinary spirits would never suspect he was among the living. The Black Warrior King, after scrutinizing the situation for a considerable time, found himself perplexed by the transformation of this peculiar being. If fear were the cause, then surely this creature was excessively timid, capable of frightening its own head off. Shaking his head, Gu Erdan's anticipated vision of the Black Warrior King devouring the internal ghostly flames of the severed head did not materialize. On the contrary, perhaps due to Gu Erdan's exceedingly bizarre demeanor, the Black Warrior King seemed disinclined to terminate him. Approaching, the Black Warrior King seized Gu Erdan's body, intending to reattach the head. However, with this exertion, everything was laid bare. Gazing at the spectral flames concealed within the armored chest cavity, and then at the flames within the head he held, the Black Warrior King's eyes widened in astonishment, exhibiting a countenance of utter confusion. By heavens! Two clusters of ghostly flames. Gu Erdan, now hoisted aloft, felt a surge of panic within. Without hesitation, he exerted himself, forcibly tearing apart his tattered armor, executing a remarkable escape akin to a cicada shedding its shell. Subsequently, his bare skeletal frame turned to flee, and as he passed by a skeletal soldier, he seized its head and hurled it at the Black Warrior King behind him. Yet, this extravagant struggle proved futile. The Black Warrior King deftly evaded the thrown head and swiftly reached out, employing his soul-consuming hand. However, this time, instead of extracting a soul, he was drawing in his adversary. Gu Erdan felt his feet lighten as he was abruptly propelled backwards, soaring several meters before the Black Warrior King clutched his vertebrae. Do not slay me. Spare my life. I am burdened with an 8,000-year-old ancestor above and a newborn sprout below. My family of over 4,000 depends on my sustenance. If you were to kill me, my headless kin would face extinction. Before the Black Warrior King could utter a word, Gu Erdan's lament echoed through the air, leaving the Black Warrior King momentarily astonished. Despite having nearly 10,000 spectral entities within his castle, with over 1,000 being third-tier Black Warriors, they remained merely low-tier specters, barely scraping the surface of mid-tier undead. Though they possessed intelligence, it was limited. After all these years, this was the first time the Black Warrior King encountered such a vibrant spirit. Silence. But I have no mouth. I lack even a head. I cannot eat, drink, or reproduce. My plight is dire. If you do not cease your incessant prattling, I shall extract your ghostly flames. The Black Warrior King, bombarded by Gu Erdan's relentless verbal onslaught, found himself at a loss for words, his attempts to retort faltering. Resigned, he resorted to threats, which evidently proved effective. As Gu Erdan, who had been shouting and struggling desperately, fell silent at the remark, the two exchanged a silent gaze, with the Black Warrior King examining him with curious interest. Are you a skeletal soldier? No, I am the Headless Horseman, merely yet to reach adulthood. Hence my strength is somewhat lacking. Huh, you claim to be the Headless Horseman? Even the weakest of them ranks at least a 7th tier. You couldn't even best his steed. Yet I truly am the Headless Horseman. See for yourself. Headless, such discrimination. At this moment, the King of the Black Knights had already carried the diminutive Gu Erdan aside to sit down. Compared to the slender figure of Gu Erdan, the King of the Black Knights was considerably larger, a fact largely attributed to his imposing armor. Casually tossing Gu Erdan onto the ground, the King of the Black Knights spoke with a hint of excitement in his voice. You possess wisdom, do you not? Upon hearing this, Gu Erdan instinctively touched the area above his neck, finding it devoid of a head. He hurriedly took the skull of his adversary from the King of the Black Knights, and, with a sharp sound, affixed it back onto his shoulders. Indeed, I do. With his head restored, Gu Erdan proudly lifted it, only for the head to unexpectedly turn around, facing backward. As Gu Erdan exerted force to realign his head, the king of the Black Knights could not suppress his amusement. Wisdom emerging from a lowly skeleton? Such a rarity. Even among my Black Knights, none possess true wisdom. Are you a natural-born intellect, or does the wisdom from your human life linger? Perhaps the latter, Gu Erdan replied. Oh, so you awaken with the wisdom of your former life? The king of the Black Knights seemed to ponder deeply, falling into silence for a considerable time before sighing. Cherish this hard-won wisdom, for your time is limited, young one. What? Initially, Gu Erdan thought he was safe since the king of the Black Knights showed no intent to kill him. However, in a mere instant, the king announced that his time was short. Could it be that this fellow could foresee fate or red faces? But that seemed impossible. Gu Erdan had never heard of anyone capable of reading the fate of a skeletal frame. Noticing Gu Erdan's confusion, the king of the Black Knights chose not to tease him further, but instead solemnly explained. Your resurrection with memories from your past life indicates that your soul has not yet been fully assimilated by the malevolent energies of the netherworld. This is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing lies in retaining your prior memories, yet the curse is that they will not endure. As the malevolent energies encroach, your memories will gradually fade and become chaotic until you are indistinguishable from them. As the king gestured to the nearby listless skeleton soldiers, Gu Erdan shuddered involuntarily. Then, how can I preserve my memories? Quite simply, transcend the 9th tier and become the legendary lord of the undead. At that point, your soul will be nearly indestructible, and you shall no longer fear the encroachment of death's aura. Is that the only way? There exists another method, which involves acquiring a pinnacle artifact crafted by humans, one capable of safeguarding the soul from corruption. With such a possession, one would naturally be impervious to the threat of erosion. The king of the Black Warriors elucidated this matter with great detail, prompting Gu Erdan to nod repeatedly. After a moment of contemplation, he suddenly posed a question. May I inquire, esteemed king of the Black Warriors, what is your situation? Upon hearing this, the king of the Black Warriors fell silent for a brief moment, then raised his hand to caress the blood-red rose pendant upon his chest, and began to speak softly. I have been resurrected in this place for 5 years. Although I exist with the will of the living, the passage of time has rendered my previous memories indistinct. Chapter 19, The Vice Captain. The helmless knight upon the 6th city wall of the city of Black Warriors, Gu Erdan, clad in tattered armor, strode confidently on patrol, accompanied by dozens of his subordinates. This entourage consisted not only of skeletal soldiers, but also included figures of the Black Warriors themselves. Perhaps in search of a conversational companion, or perhaps intrigued by Gu Erdan's character, the king of the Black Warriors did not eliminate him. On the contrary, the Black Warrior known as Klundal Sala extended an olive branch, inviting him to join the ranks. Faced with such an invitation from a 5th-tier powerhouse, Gu Erdan readily consented. Thus, at this moment, Gu Erdan ascended to the rank of team leader, commanding not only over 41st-tier skeletal soldiers of his choosing, but also 10 Black Warriors bestowed upon him by Sala. Initially, Sala intended to select some advanced skeletal soldiers for Gu Erdan, such as 2nd-tier skeletal sentinels or bone warriors. However, this gesture of goodwill was declined by Gu Erdan, who expressed his preference for cultivating his subordinates from the ground up, relishing the process. In truth, recruiting 2nd-tier skeletal soldiers proved challenging. 1st-tier ones were far easier to manage. The 10 Black Warriors accompanying Gu Erdan were all of 3rd-tier strength. These formidable beings were not there to monitor him. A mere 2nd-tier pawn like Gu Erdan did not warrant the scrutiny of 10 Black Warriors. Rather, these 10 experts were genuinely assigned to him as subordinates by the king of the Black Warriors, ready to heed his commands unless Gu Erdan sought to incite rebellion. Gazing at the Black Warriors stationed beside him, each equipped with 4 javelins and clad in exquisite armaments, Gu Erdan felt a surge of envy. Behold, behold, what it means to have a leader, what it means to have a benefactor. In comparison to the esteemed Lord Sala, what was that skeletal sorcerer in the past? Can one blame Gu Erdan for considering rebellion and risking his life? Had that sorcerer treated Gu Erdan as Sala did, how could rebellion have ever crossed his mind? Patting the shoulder plate of a nearby Black Warrior, Gu Erdan suddenly sighed in frustration. You all are indeed remarkable, yet alas, you are not my confidants. You are unwilling to share your soul fragments with me. I fear my enhancements may not extend to you. The prowess of Gu Erdan surpassed that of the Black Knights by a significant margin, which destined them to heed his commands without truly pledging their loyalty. This realization filled Gu Erdan with profound frustration. After taking a few steps forward and listening to the chaotic clinking of his tattered armor, he lowered his gaze to inspect his dismal attire. In his desperate attempt to escape, the armor, already in a dilapidated state, had become a mere collection of scraps, hardly deserving the title of armor. Gazing at his pitiful gear and then glancing at the imposing figure of the Black Knight beside him, an idea sparked in Gu Erdan's mind. He casually draped an arm around the shoulders of the Black Knight. "Ah, young brother, I see your armor bears no scratches whatsoever. You must be a fresh recruit on the battlefield, am I right? Let me tell you, my friend, armor doesn't necessarily improve with age. Those so-called scars are a mark of glory on the battlefield. Look at my own armor, the Miao King set. It's riddled with marks of battle. Each one tells a tale of bloodshed and struggle, standing as the finest testament of valor." As he spoke, Gu Erdan suddenly reached for his weapon at his waist, only to find it severely rusted. After a prolonged struggle, he managed to extract it, albeit it was broken. Behold, the tetanus blade, a precious artifact imbued by the finest masters. It has special effects against humans. A light wound can lead to infection. A severe one may result in instant demise. Come now, out of pity for you, I shall graciously exchange my gear with you. Be a good lad and remove your armor and weapon. As he spoke, Gu Erdan began to strip off his Miao King armor, shoving both it and the broken tetanus blade into the hands of the Black Knight. However, despite his limited intellect, the Black Knight was not devoid of basic judgment. A beggar's garb and a rusted sword hardly constituted a treasure. The broken blade, in truth, would struggle to even harm a chicken, let alone a human. Though he caught the items, the Black Knight stood still, showing no inclination to undress. Witnessing this, Gu Erdan's expression stiffened and his gaze sharpened. "Young brother, do not mistake my kindness for weakness. I am the boss here. Henceforth, I declare your armor confiscated. Remove it at once." With a sudden lunge, Gu Erdan attempted to forcibly wrest the Black Knight's armor away. Naturally, the Black Knight was unwilling to acquiesce, leading to a relentless struggle atop the walls that lasted over an hour. Ultimately, the Black Knight, too intimidated to retaliate, suffered defeat, left with nothing but his undergarments. All of his armaments, bracers, greaves, and helmet, had been claimed by Gu Erdan. The only reason the last remnants of his underarmor remained unscathed was not due to Gu Erdan's conscience, but rather because he found it cumbersome to wear, and the chainmail-like fabric wrist scraping against his bones. As Gu Erdan joyfully donned his new gear, the Black Knight was left in disarray amidst the winds. After a brief flurry of activity, Gu Erdan transformed from a pitiful skeletal figure into a fully armed knight of battle, clad in an entire suit of pitch-black heavy armor. With 4 javelins secured at his back, a shield in his left hand, and a spear in his right, he exuded an aura of formidable power. The only flaw, albeit a minor one, was the blood-red rose emblazoned on his chest, which gave off a somewhat effeminate impression. However, Gu Erdan could understand this. In his world's medieval period, Western Europe had a penchant for adorning their banners with various flowers, such as roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums. Once fully equipped, Gu Erdan attempted to don his helmet, only to be met with a fierce bite from an unruly skull. Fortunately, this time, the skull's bite landed on his arm guard, causing no harm to Gu Erdan. Frustrated by the uncooperative head of his adversary, he nearly succumbed to the urge to toss it aside. Clutching the helmet, Gu Erdan surveyed his surroundings, ultimately fixing his gaze upon the Black Knight who had been stripped of his garments. "Ah, young brother, I hereby officially appoint you as my vice-captain. From this moment forth, you shall be my right-hand man. You shall henceforth be known as the knight without a helm. Come, come, this helmet is for you. From now on, you shall be my armor, tasked with protecting my head." Perhaps feeling a tad guilty, Gu Erdan placed the unused helmet upon the Black Knight's head while bestowing upon him a new identity and promoting him to the position of vice-captain. Yet, as he spoke, Gu Erdan couldn't help but grin at the knight's appearance, stifling a laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Chapter 20. The Perilous Siege. The Black Knight, often mistaken by the uninitiated as an upgraded version of a skeleton soldier, was, in fact, something quite different. Strictly speaking, the Black Knight was a variant of a zombie, an evolved form of a corpse. Once the armor was removed, the Black Knight's body revealed itself to be severely diminished, far less imposing than it appeared. The shriveled skin clung to the bones, resembling desiccated jerky, and the visage was far from appealing, with sunken features that made him appear less dignified than a mere skeleton soldier. Placing the helmet upon him to conceal his grotesque face, Gu Erdan nodded in satisfaction before striding confidently with his soldiers to continue their patrol. Now equipped, his gear was undoubtedly on par with that of the Headless Knight, at least in appearance. If only he could procure a steed, he could instantly cosplay as the Headless Knight. The mere thought filled him with excitement. With enthusiasm, Gu Erdan swiftly circled the city walls, then returned to the town center with his companions in a show of confidence. In truth, there was little to patrol within the 7th ring of walls. After all, the outermost ring had not been breached, so how could enemies be discovered within? The so-called patrol was merely a pretext to keep busy. Upon returning to the core area, Gu Erdan encountered the Black Knight King, Sarah, once more. After his surrender, Gu Erdan frequently engaged in conversation with Sarah, endeavoring to glean a clearer understanding of the world from him. After all, perusing those severely tattered tomes could hardly compare to hearing first-hand accounts. Sarah welcomed this interaction, having not engaged in normal discourse for several years. Moreover, Gu Erdan's playful demeanor and his penchant for peculiar knowledge made him an endearing companion. In the presence of the Emperor, he would be regarded as a favored minister. Beside the Dark Knight King Sarah, he was deemed a trusted confidant. Upon Gu Erdan's return, Sarah initially failed to recognize him due to his change of attire. Once he discerned Gu Erdan's identity and examined his armor, a hint of amusement lingered in Sarah's gaze for reasons unknown. Gu Erdan noticed this and promptly inquired, but regrettably, Sarah had no intention of responding, merely laughing as he walked away. The sound of Sarah's laughter, akin to nails scraping across a chalkboard, caused Gu Erdan's lips to twitch involuntarily. The entire internal anatomy of those withered corpses had long since desiccated, including their throats. It was a rarity for them to produce any sound, let alone one that was melodious. Such expectations were utterly absurd. This hoarse and piercing voice was enough to terrify a child, hardly the sound one would associate with benevolence. After several days of recuperation, the injured Dark Knights had nearly fully healed. As for the skeletal soldiers, those with lighter wounds were now able to move freely, while the severely injured had already become sustenance for their fellow skeletons. The black sun once again radiated its light, an intangible force of death enveloping the area, awakening countless corpses that conformed to the standards, transforming them into members of the undead army. Meanwhile, a substantial force had assembled atop the Dark Knight Castle, with 7 defensive lines meticulously arranged, and the blood-red rose banner slowly ascending. It was only today that Gu Erdan finally comprehended why these seemingly formidable Dark Knights had previously sustained such grievous injuries. It was a consequence of their own making. The massive banner looming above did not appear solitary. Numerous heads containing 4th-tier soul flames dangled in front, and atop the banner, a colossal bull's head was prominently displayed. Within the eye sockets of the bull's head, soul flames, darkening to the point of nearly blackening, blazed fiercely. 5th-tier soul flames. A blatant bait. A 5th-tier flame coupled with over 24th-tier flames brazenly placed in the heart of the castle, luring the attention of countless spirits. These undead creatures, accustomed to acting on instinct, could hardly withstand such temptation. In mere moments, a multitude of them began to march towards this irresistible allure. Among them were skeletons, ghouls, and even specters. Gazing at the seemingly endless tide of foes, Gu Erdan stood beside Sarah, his lips twitching uncontrollably. "Boss, are you certain we can win this battle?" With both hands resting on a knight's sword, Sarah did not even turn his head at the remark. "We can. How can you be so sure? 3 years ago, I took this path, and 3 years later, I still stand here. This is the source of my confidence." Amidst their conversation, the first wave of assault by these undead has commenced. To be precise, they possess but a singular offensive, as all the undead mindlessly charge forward, swiftly overwhelming the entire expanse beneath the city. Skeletons trample one another, and zombies accumulate in heaps, forming a mound of corpses and bones that even fills the moat. They utilize their bodies as a foundation, creating a sloping ramp directly beneath the city walls. The brutal melee begins. The area where Gu Erdan and his companions find themselves is hardly a treasure trove. The most evident proof lies in the fact that Gu Erdan has never encountered advanced undead. The 5th-tier Black Knight, Sarah, is the most formidable being Gu Erdan has encountered in these past few months. It is precisely for this reason that a 5th-tier ghost flame appears so elusive. The enemies drawn to battle are predominantly newly resurrected novices, albeit in staggering numbers that stretch endlessly across the landscape. Among them are numerous factions attempting to seize the opportunity, such as the Skeleton Legion centered around skeleton sorcerers and the Animal Legion based on tribes. Gu Erdan even glimpses several colossal figures among them. These are monstrous beings towering over 5 meters, exceptionally robust in build. Some are skeletal, others are zombies, and among them is one composed of countless corpses stitched together. This reveals Gu Erdan's unfamiliarity with the knowledge of this world. Had he ventured into the human realm, he would undoubtedly have heard the name of such creatures. The Stitched Corpse Fiend. Typically, these are the last resort of necromancers. Unlike high-tier undead beings such as bone dragons, corpse dragons, or headless knights, these advanced undead are beyond the capabilities of ordinary necromancers to create. The terrifying materials and energy required to forge high-tier undead would cause any necromancer to faint. To create a headless knight, one must possess a 7th-tier corpse, specifically that of a robust warrior. Furthermore, one must gather enough potent souls to animate the corpse. ideally of 7th tier quality or higher. If that is unattainable, it certainly must not be lower than 6th tier. It is imperative to note that human warriors typically prioritize physical cultivation, leading to a disparity between their soul power and their physical prowess. 7th tier warriors often possess souls of 5th tier or even lower quality, as their fighting spirit does not rely on their souls for propulsion. In essence, to forge a headless knight, merely slaying a 7th tier warrior is insufficient. One must first eliminate a 7th tier warrior to obtain his corpse, and then slay a mage of at least 6th tier to seize his soul. Yet, herein lies the conundrum. If a necromancer possesses such strength, why would they resort to creating a headless knight? Due to their lack of strength, they were compelled to create headless knights as a trump card. However, the production of these headless knights necessitated the elimination of formidable opponents, a task they were entirely incapable of achieving, thus trapping them in a vicious cycle. Eventually, a genius among the necromancers devised a spell, the renowned stitching technique, which allowed for the amalgamation of various corpses, resulting in the creation of a grotesque monstrosity. The higher the quality of the assembled corpses, the greater the strength of the resulting creature. This being, famously known as the stitching corpse demon, has become the ultimate trump card for the majority of contemporary necromancers. This technique does not require high-quality corpses. Rather, it relies on sheer numbers, an approach that any necromancer can employ. Chapter 21. Daily Offense and Defense. The brutal slaughter continued unabated. The first line of defense, unable to withstand the onslaught, was breached by a colossal dry corpse towering over 7 meters, shattering a gap and signaling its complete collapse. The second line of defense fell next, breached by the immense stitching corpse demon. Initially, Gu Erdan believed that after transforming into a skeletal figure, he had developed a formidable capacity to endure. However, upon encountering this gigantic monstrosity, he found himself somewhat overwhelmed. Everywhere, dismembered human and animal limbs were visible. Some hung limply while others still flailed in attack. Among them were numerous decapitated heads, evoking a sense of dread. Yet, this was not the most terrifying aspect of the stitching corpse demon. In this realm of the undead, no living being could survive, which meant that the components of the demon were all lifeless. Had this occurred in the human world, many of the corpses stitched into its form might still be alive, perpetually tormented and wailing in agony. Such a scene would resemble a hellish nightmare, sufficient to drive any faint-hearted soul into madness. It is precisely due to such brutal methods that necromancers have become the universally despised pariahs. With the first and second lines of defense fallen, the subsequent 2 lines also crumbled swiftly. Observing the multitude of enemies flooding into the midsection, Sarah suddenly gestured with a wave of her hand. The Black Knights, who had been poised and ready in the rear, began to advance along the path atop the city walls. Although the colossal dry corpses and the stitching corpse demon appeared fearsome, their actual power was rather limited. They merely relied on their imposing size to barely reach the 4th tier of strength. A mere squad of 20 Black Knights would suffice to eliminate them. The reason these creatures were able to brazenly breach the 5th line of defense was solely due to Sarah's deliberate strategy, intended to ensnare them. The defenders at the previous 4 lines were nothing more than cannon fodder. Not even a single Black Knight or a skeleton soldier of higher than the 2nd tier was present. Their mission was to perish while serving as a delay tactic, effectively segmenting the enemy forces. It was not until the adversaries surged into the central position that the true defensive apparatus of the castle was fully revealed. The immobile trebuchets atop the city walls sprang into action, while skeletal soldiers began to transport stones to hurl at the breaches. As for the Black Knights, these armored figures had already positioned themselves on the ramparts, selecting their targets with deadly precision. A flurry of javelins descended, and even a 4th tier entity, if targeted, faced a grim fate of either death or grievous injury. Those of the 3rd tier were often instantaneously slain. Their sole responsibility was to eliminate high-level undead, while they paid no heed to the 1st or 2nd tier adversaries. These feeble foes, witnessing their stronger companions fall around them, chose not to retreat in terror. Instead, they rushed towards the corpses, desperately tearing at the soul flames to consume them, some even resorting to violence among themselves. The once mindless horde of undead, charging forward, descended into chaos in an instant, coming to a complete halt before the 5th wall. The flanks of the ramparts were lined with Black Knights, their javelins raining down like a tempest, laying a thick carpet of corpses below. In the face of such terrifying firepower, the frenzied undead continued their brutal contest for the soul flames, displaying no concern for their own survival. This scene prompted Gu Erdan to shake his head. Indeed, all ailments can find remedy, save for the affliction of foolishness. The siege endured for several hours, concluding only as twilight approached. Toward the end, some of the more cunning undead attempted to flee, but the Black Knights formed an impenetrable line at the breach, leaving them with no escape. Along the way, Gu Erdan and his comrades encountered a peculiar situation. Some flying undead attempted to swoop down from above to seize the spoils from the flag. Unfortunately, they were met with a volley of javelins from the vigilant Black Knights. This sort of offensive and defensive conflict was not a novel experience for Sarah and her companions. They had long since honed their skills. The Black Knights executed their roles with clarity, defending, sealing off, and hunting, leaving no opportunity for the enemy to exploit. With the siege concluded, Sarah not only sustained no losses among her high-tier soul flames, but also amassed 6 4th-tier and 27 3rd-tier flames, along with countless lesser ones. Once the enemy was entirely eradicated, Sarah promptly consumed a 4th-tier flame and, after a brief moment of hesitation, surprisingly offered one to Gu Erdan, leaving him momentarily stunned. Sarah, unfazed by his bewilderment, approached the pile of fallen undead, extracting the robust corpses that had been sorted, and began the process of creating her subordinates. The 3rd-tier soul flame she held gradually unfurled, enveloping the corpses in a shroud of black fire. As the 3-ringed necromantic spell, Black Knight Resurrection, was cast, the motionless bodies on the ground began to quiver slightly. Flesh twisted and shriveled, and the carefully arranged bones around them writhed, gradually encasing the corpses within. As the spell concluded, the corpses on the ground had undergone a remarkable transformation. Morphing into a Black Knight adorned with ebony armor and bearing a blood-red rose totem emblazoned upon its chest. Observing Sarah expend considerable effort to utilize the hard-earned 20-plus 3rd-tier soul flames to forge this Black Knight, Gu Erdan found himself somewhat perplexed. While having powerful subordinates is undoubtedly advantageous, an excess is not necessarily beneficial. The city's expanse is limited, and with over 1,000 Black Knights already at his disposal. Why does Sarah insist on augmenting his ranks? Not one to shy away from inquiry, Gu Erdan posed his question directly. Sarah's response was succinct. These Black Knights would prove useful in the future, hence the need for an increase in numbers. The first day of the offensive and defensive battle passed in silence, and as the black sun rose on the second day, a new round of warfare commenced. The banners were raised as ever, and the ghostly flames lured the adversary. The relentless army surged forth, besieging the city. This battle endured for a week, during which various unforeseen incidents transpired. After all, the spells of the undead were diverse, with some exhibiting extraordinary power, posing threats even to the Black Knights. In response to such challenges, Sarah would invariably take the initiative, suppressing the enemy with his formidable strength. As 7 days elapsed, on the 8th day, the city of Black Knights opted to refrain from further self-destructive actions and instead began to rally skeleton warriors from the canyon to tend to the wounded subordinates. In casual conversation, Gu Erdan discerned the canyon's peculiar nature. Every 7 days, a significant number of skeleton warriors would resurrect, and their volatile dispositions rendered them impossible to reclaim. Sarah was equally unaware of the situation, only knowing that the canyon had always been thus since his arrival. The very reason he chose to construct a fortress here was largely due to this enigmatic canyon, with its capacity to regularly provide abundant soul flames. Sarah was certainly not inclined to overlook it, especially given the treacherous terrain, which rendered it a formidable stronghold. Yet, treasures attract trouble, owing to the canyon's allure. Sarah had encountered his fair share of difficulties. The recent injuries sustained by many Black Knights were attributed to incursions by formidable foes. Strikingly, these adversaries were not solely intent on exploiting the canyon. Chapter 22. The Hidden Peril. This implies that this area was once the domain of a skeletal general? After you arrived and took a liking to it, you not only usurped it, but nearly decimated its previous inhabitants? The one who managed to escape began to recruit forces, relentlessly seeking vengeance against you? Upon hearing Sarah's explanation, Gu Erdan crossed his arms, deep in thought. It seemed that from any angle, their side did not appear virtuous. At that moment, Gu Erdan and his companions were engaged in a discussion regarding the origins of the city of Black Knights and the enigmatic identity of the canyon behind them. Through Sarah's brief remarks, Gu Erdan gleaned that this place was originally not under Sarah's dominion. Indeed, the realm of the undead is as such. If he cannot maintain his hold here, even without my interference, it will inevitably be seized by others in the future. Sarah exhibited no remorse for appropriating another's possessions, her demeanor exuding a sense of righteousness. After all, in the land of the undead, such contests for dominance have long become a customary affair. Is that skeletal general particularly formidable? Not at all. Although he possesses 5th-tier strength, his prowess is merely average and not a match for me, albeit he is somewhat resilient. How did your last encounter result in such heavy casualties? Recently, he secured a confederate, a malevolent undead beast on the verge of breaking into the 6th tier, the Bone Beast. Faced with a 2-on-1 situation, I was certainly at a disadvantage. Sarah's words prompted Gu Erdan to hastily rummage through the tomes in his backpack. The bone beast is rumored to be a pet of the Grim Reaper, capable of devouring bones to augment its size, causing the very earth to tremble as it moves. With its strength being unpredictable, some are strong, others weak. Yet, the countermeasures are lacking. Each time I reach a critical juncture, the pages are missing. Gazing at the severely incomplete tome in his hands, Gu Erdan could not help but curse under his breath. Seated beside him, Sarah suddenly interjected, stating that the countermeasure involves seeking confined terrains for combat to restrict the opponent's movements, or deploying a team for extermination. This is common knowledge on the continent, requiring no reference to texts. By the way, the book you possess is an antiquity from over a century ago, long rendered obsolete, and the information contained therein is not entirely accurate. Sarah's comment immediately drew a peculiar glance from Gu Erdan. Did this fellow not claim to have forgotten his memories from life? Yet, he recited information with remarkable fluency. It seemed he was simply reluctant to broach matters of his past, and Gu Erdan, recognizing this, refrained from pressing further. After stowing away the book, Gu Erdan resumed his inquiries regarding enemy intelligence. Apart from the two of them, are there other foes? Certainly, but they are merely a disorganized rabble, skeleton soldiers, zombies, and even animal undead, essentially a hodgepodge of every conceivable type. These two are inept at military maneuvers and lack comprehension of troop organization, recruiting indiscriminately, merely for the sake of numbers. At this juncture, Sarah let out a sudden sigh. Nonetheless, even a ragtag army possesses its advantages. In a recent battle, we fell victim to an ambush. A swarm of digging skeleton mice unearthed a tunnel, allowing the skeletal general to lead his elite troops directly into the heart of the city, coordinating with the bone beast outside, nearly breaching my stronghold. Had I not fought valiantly to frighten off that skeletal general, I might have met my demise at their hands. The ability to tunnel is indeed quite troublesome. Rubbing his nose, Gu Erdan found himself inexplicably reminded of scenes from films depicting tunnel warfare. This method of combat lacks effective countermeasures. After all, there are indeed those who can steal for 1,000 days, but who can defend against thieves for 1,000 days? They merely need to dig in any direction. And Gu Erdan and his companions cannot possibly defend against every potential approach. Even if they wished to, it would be an impossible task. As Gu Erdan pondered how to counter such tactics, a sudden uproar erupted within the city. Hearing the commotion, Sarah sprang to her feet, gripping her longsword tightly with one hand while drawing a halberd with the other. Trouble loomed. They were coming again. With that exclamation, Sarah hastily dashed forward, turning briefly to caution Gu Erdan. The enemy is formidable. Stay safe. Do not run about recklessly. Sarah, accompanied by her black-armored warrior retinue, swiftly advanced towards the source of the noise. As for Gu Erdan, he certainly would not flee in disarray. Not only did he refrain from panicking, but upon realizing the presence of external foes, he actively distanced himself from them. Leading his small squad, Gu Erdan ascended towards a vantage point far from the tumult. Upon reaching the heart of the castle, he stood atop the ramparts, audaciously resting a foot upon the battlement, one hand clutching a battered pair of binoculars, intently surveying the chaos below. These binoculars were among the spoils Gu Erdan had scavenged from a corpse, yet they were severely damaged. Rust marred their surface. One lens was completely shattered, while the other, though relatively intact, had required Gu Erdan's painstaking efforts to restore. Through the lens, he observed the castle engulfed in turmoil. A multitude of skeletal mice surged forth from the earth, closely followed by various undead entities. These creatures charged towards nearby adversaries with alarming fervor. Their emergence was rather sophisticated. It remained a mystery how they had conducted their reconnaissance, for the very spots from which the skeletal mice emerged were invariably marked by a considerable accumulation of spectral flames. Beneath banners intended to lure enemies, or within storerooms brimming with spoils, had Sarah not taken precautions in advance by stationing heavy guards, it was likely that all the treasures they had painstakingly acquired would have been snatched away by their foes. Continuously observing through the binoculars, Gu Erdan soon discerned Sarah's figure amidst the throng below. At that moment, she stood beyond the sixth wall, fiercely battling the numerous foes that had emerged from there, which was also the location of the storeroom for spectral flames. Just as Sarah plunged into the fray, seemingly unchallenged, a raucous laughter resonated suddenly. With a thunderous crash, dust billowed from the ground as a towering skeleton clad in grotesque bone armor and wielding a long blade leapt from the cavern, instantly cleaving two black-armored warriors in half. The skeletal general, Sarah, the formidable foe that had appeared, let out a roar of fury, clearly harboring a deep-seated grudge against Sarah. Responding to the sound, Sarah did not hesitate. After kicking aside an advancing skeletal hound, she unleashed a powerful thrust. The obsidian-hued bone spear hurtled through the air, leaving a dark trail behind. And with a swift clang, The quick-witted skeletal general deftly parried the incoming javelin, deflecting it with a flourish of his blade. The Death Javelin, a second-tier necromantic spell, lacks the explosive power of the skeletal archer's bone arrows. Its sole capability lies in its sheer destructive force, an embodiment of unadulterated devastation, devoid of any ostentation or remarkable attributes. Beyond its swiftness, the Death Javelin epitomizes ruthlessness. With a resounding crack, the javelin, sliced in two, continued its trajectory, merely altering its course slightly. A flash of black cold light streaked past, piercing through over 20 undead in a single thrust. Witnessing such terrifying destructive power, even the skeletal general, who had previously withstood the attack, could not help but reveal a profound sense of trepidation, despite having encountered it before. Chapter 23. The Battle of High-Tier Undead Sarah. Decaying. The two formidable adversaries, bound by a deep-seated grudge forged years prior, required little exchange of words upon their meeting, immediately engaging in a life-and-death struggle. The clanging of weapons reverberated as Decaying wielded a long-handled broadsword, its blade impressively broad, reminiscent of the legendary green dragon crescent blade. As for Sarah, he adeptly employed a spear and shield, with a sword sheathed at his waist. Sparks flew as the two clashed fiercely, unable to gain the upper hand after dozens of exchanges. However, it was evident to any discerning observer that while both were fifth-tier undead, Sarah's combat skills far surpassed those of Decaying, even managing to exert a crushing dominance over him. His fighting technique, honed through rigorous training and clearly acquired through systematic learning, was a sight to behold. In stark contrast to Sarah's exquisite martial prowess, Decaying's skills were rather rudimentary. As a native skeleton of the underworld, his combat abilities had evolved solely through untamed means. While he might prevail against other undead, he found himself at a distinct disadvantage when facing Sarah, who retained memories of the human realm. Yet, Decaying's bone structure was remarkably resilient. Even Sarah's most formidable thrusts merely sparked against him, failing to inflict any significant damage or leave a mark, aside from causing a brief stumble. From atop the city walls, Gu Erdan meticulously adjusted his angle of observation, suddenly setting down his telescope with a vigorous shake, producing a clatter of glass. This won't do. The reconnaissance ability provided by the system cannot be activated from such a distance. I must approach. The soul fire flickered restlessly as Gu Erdan hesitated momentarily before deciding to take the risk of getting closer. In a battle of equal strength, information becomes paramount, and gathering intelligence was Gu Erdan's forte. He was unwilling to see the formidable ally he had painstakingly found perish before him so soon, especially given how rare it was to encounter such a foolishly loyal leader in the realm of the undead. With a decisive wave, Gu Erdan leaped from the city wall, followed closely by his subordinates, who also jumped down from the 3-meter-high barrier. At this moment, Gu Erdan's followers had undergone a remarkable transformation. The Black Knights need not be mentioned. Strictly speaking, this group does not qualify as the subordinates of Gu Erdan. They are merely dispatched by Sarah, still retaining their third-tier strength, with their appearance unchanged in the slightest. In stark contrast, the skeletal soldiers personally recruited by Gu Erdan, who have pledged their souls to the ghostly flames, have undergone significant transformations, now numbering over 130. These skeletal soldiers have all reached the pinnacle of second-tier strength, showcasing a diverse array of types. Among them are the defensive skeletal guardians, the offensive bone warriors, and the versatile skeletal fighters, all present within Gu Erdan's squad. Moreover, among these over 100 subordinates, Gu Erdan has meticulously assembled more than 30 skeletal archers. These beings, originally struggling to survive in the wilderness, face immense challenges in advancing to the second tier. The skeletal archers rank as the second rarest species among the skeletal soldiers. As for the rarest, that distinction belongs to the skeletal mages, whom Gu Erdan has yet to encounter. It is said that these mages can cast elemental spells akin to human sorcerers. Unfortunately, their limited internal energy leads to a formidable but unsustainable burst of power, making survival in the wild exceedingly difficult. Furthermore, skeletal mages must be created from corpses that have undergone magical training, rendering it quite challenging to find suitable materials in the realm of the undead. However, in the human world, the number of skeletal mages is not insignificant, as nearly every necromancer tends to keep a few skeletal mages as trump cards. Over 100 of them surged forth along the slope, launching a devastating ambush on the unsuspecting foes ahead. Yet, the impact was minimal. In a battle involving tens of thousands of undead, a mere 100 individuals was but a drop in the ocean, hardly capable of stirring significant waves. Under the close protection of his subordinates, Gu Erdan dashed along the city walls, searching for an angle to bridge the distance with Sarah and the others below. As for leaping down from the walls to approach them, Gu Erdan dared not entertain such thoughts, If one wishes to court death, they may leap alone. But please do not drag him into it. Thank you. Fortune favors the diligent, while pursuing the two along the walls. Gu Erdan finally seized an opportunity to successfully employ his reconnaissance ability on decaying. In the next moment, a wealth of data materialized before his eyes. Name, Skeletal General, decaying, Identity, 5th Tier Undead, Intermediate, Skills, 1st Ring Undead Spell, Bone Armor, 2nd Ring Undead Spell, Low-Level Skeletal Enhancement, 3rd Ring Undead Spell, Wailing of the Departed, 4th Ring Undead Spell, Land of the Dead, 5th Ring Undead Spell, Intermediate Skeletal Enhancement Description. It has been proven that even in the absence of martial prowess or combat skills, one can still survive and thrive if they possess sufficient resilience. Gazing at the data of this skeletal general below, particularly his array of skills, Gu Erdan could not help but silently curse within. What a formidable set of 5 spells. There are a total of 5 spells, 3 of which are primarily defensive in nature. As for the remaining 2, the 3rd tier Wailing of the Undead has already been witnessed by Gu Erdan. This spell produces a silent, furious roar that inflicts area of effect damage in all directions. While the damage is not substantial, it is sufficient to repel 4th tier foes, injure 3rd tier adversaries, maim 2nd tier opponents, and annihilate 1st tier enemies. Sarah has endured this attack multiple times without suffering the slightest impact, clearly indicating that it is primarily a tactic for dispatching weaker foes. As for the 4th tier spell, Realm of the Dead, this technique possesses intriguing qualities. As decaying plunges his weapon into the ground, a vast amount of ghostly energy surges forth, transforming into countless erratic specters that relentlessly assail enemies from all sides. Upon vanquishing foes, these specters can immediately consume the souls of the fallen, rapidly converting them into energy to enhance the spell's duration and generate even more apparitions. This combination, when paired with the area-clearing capability of the Wailing of the Undead, forms a remarkably potent synergy. Alas, it is rendered ineffective against Sarah. The 4th tier necromantic spell, Soul Snatching Hand, operates by forcibly extracting the souls of weaker enemies. When targeting a single foe, it can even forcibly draw out the soul of a 4th tier opponent. However, if too many foes are targeted, or if the enemies possess superior strength, the spell's efficacy diminishes significantly, though it can still destabilize the opponent's soul, making it challenging for them to maintain control. This spell serves primarily as a means of restraint, proving ineffective against equally matched adversaries. Yet, when combined with Sarah's 5th tier spells, everything changes. Soul Detonation, as its name implies, allows one to detonate the captured soul, resulting in widespread and devastating damage. By first using Soul Snatching Hand to extract the souls of weaker enemies, Sarah can then unleash a soul detonation, hurling these souls like grenades. The terrifying explosion clears the battlefield, and before the enemies can recover from the violent blast, Sarah swiftly reaches out again, gathering the scattered soul fragments of the slain like swallows returning to their nests. In the next moment, these fragments are propelled forth with even greater speed, resulting in another wave of explosive devastation. Simplicity, mindlessness, yet effective. If decaying's combination of spells is deemed perfect, then Sarah's spell synergy can only be described as outrageous. Were it not for decaying's formidable physique, bolstered by intermediate skeletal enhancement that allows him to disregard Sarah's typical attacks and sustain minimal harm even amidst a soul detonation, he might have already succumbed to Sarah's overwhelming power. Chapter 24. The Reaper's Chosen. The Bone Colossus decaying abruptly drove his weapon into the ground, and in an instant, dark energy surged forth, swirling around him like a vortex. Countless souls of the undead, which decaying had yet to consume, transformed into shadowy apparitions, shrouded in black mist as they surged forward towards Sarah. Unexpectedly, at that moment, Sarah suddenly grasped with one hand, and the myriad of flickering starlights within the fallen undead swirled toward him at incredible speed, converging in his outstretched palm. With a thunderous roar, Sarah forcefully thrust her left palm forward, and the countless fragments of souls converging within it surged forth, forming a dazzling array of luminous beams in midair. The detonation of souls. The beams collided violently with the swirling black mist vortex, resulting in a fierce explosion. Decaying, bracing himself on his weapon, knelt on one knee, struggling for mere seconds before being overwhelmed and violently propelled away by the concentrated assault of soul detonations. The intricate spell of the Land of the Dead he had painstakingly invoked was thus rendered null. His body spun helplessly through the air, buffeted by the colorful soul bombs, which caused him to tremble and accelerate uncontrollably, ultimately crashing over 30 meters away with a resounding thud. Witnessing this scene, Sarah could not suppress a cold snort. Instead of halting her assault, she suddenly raised her left hand and let out a furious roar. Countless beams of light erupted, more dissipating souls converged from all directions. The Four Rings Necromancy, the Hand of Soul Extraction. It must be said that these two spells were exceptionally suited for combat on the battlefield, granting Sarah an almost invincible presence. Yet, it was merely an illusion of invincibility. Before Sarah could fully gather the souls to continue her assault on the distant decaying, a shadow suddenly loomed overhead. Sensing the impending threat, Sarah quickly looked up, only to see a massive bone sphere, measuring several meters in diameter, plummeting swiftly from above. Her pupils constricted in response, and without a moment's hesitation, she directed the gathered souls skyward. The torrent of souls, illuminated in a myriad of colors, arced towards the heavens, resulting in a series of thunderous explosions. Amidst the fiery chaos, the swiftly descending bone sphere shattered into countless pieces. Some fragments were incinerated before they even touched the ground. After successfully thwarting this sudden attack, Sarah chose not to pursue, but instead drew a spear from behind, firmly planting it beside her, her fierce gaze fixed upon the distance. Outside the perimeter of the city walls, a colossal beast was slowly retracting its tail. This creature, bizarre in form, was constructed entirely from bones, yet unlike other skeletal warriors, it was devoid of any gaps. On the contrary, it resembled a solid mass, though entirely composed of bone. The skeletal fragments were compressed to such an extent that not a single seam was visible, only the multitude of connections between bones. With a length exceeding 20 meters. Even when crouched, its height was still an imposing 4 to 5 meters, accompanied by spiny bone protrusions akin to a porcupine, and a fearsome skull crafted from countless other skulls. This monstrous entity emerging beyond the city walls was more terrifying than a specter emerging from a nightmare. A fifth-tier siege-bone beast, the legendary pet of the Grim Reaper, a nightmare bred for harvesting souls, the Beast of Bones. At this moment, the fearsome creature loomed ominously, its claws resting upon the crumbling city wall. Behind it, a colossal tail, constructed from an assortment of bones, thrashed violently, propelling a multitude of bones into the air, which swiftly coalesced into a mass of white skeletal orbs. The outermost wall had already been breached, and the speed of the assault was alarming. Judging by the extensive collapse, it was highly probable that this sudden manifestation of the skeletal beast had relied on sheer brute force to demolish it. The remaining segment of the wall was just sufficient for the creature to perch its claws upon. Gu Erdan, upon witnessing this gargantuan being appear beyond the city walls, was momentarily rendered speechless. In comparison to this monstrosity, the previously encountered corpses of giants and massive skeletons appeared as mere children. Such an immense physique, such terrifying strength. Could this truly be a mere fifth-tier undead? As Gu Erdan stood in shock, the skeletal behemoth launched another attack from a distance. Its method of assault was remarkably straightforward. It gathered bones upon its tail, and then, with a sudden flick, hurled them skyward. Although this approach resembled that of a mindless catapult, the results were astonishingly devastating. A massive skeletal orb arced through the air, and this time, Sarah opted not to confront it head-on, for he was no fool. Engaging with an adversary skilled in devastation would be sheer folly. Utilizing his agility, he deftly evaded the trajectory of the oncoming orb, suppressing a disdainful snort as it whooshed past. However, the undead engaged in combat behind him were not as fortunate. With a resounding crash, the enormous skeletal orb, measuring over 5 meters in diameter, struck the ground and began to bounce erratically. Ultimately, amidst a cacophony of noise, the orb collided violently with the wall to Sarah's right. The ebony wall, robust enough to withstand the full force of a fourth-tier giant skeleton multiple times, was astonishingly penetrated in an instant by this skeletal orb. Gu Erdan, staring at the colossal orb that had embedded itself beyond the wall, felt a tremor of fear coursing through him. Was this truly classified as a fifth-tier undead? With such destructive capability, one could easily believe it to be a ninth tier. How could it possibly be rated as merely fifth tier? The sheer terror of the skeletal beast's destructive power had thoroughly unsettled Gu Erdan, prompting him to seriously question the creature's strength. Yet, he remained oblivious to the geographical and cultural nuances of this world, as well as the criteria for evaluating power. Despite the overwhelming destructive potential of this skeletal beast, which wreaked havoc upon cities, it was indeed only rated at fifth tier. Strength is not solely determined by destructive capacity. It also encompasses speed, defense, and reaction abilities. The skeletal beast possessed immense strength and a formidable bony armor, rendering it a formidable opponent both offensively and defensively. If unleashed within a city, it would undoubtedly spell disaster. This is also the reason why he is referred to as the Grim Reaper's pet, a merciless machine designed to harvest souls. However, should he confront an adversary of equal prowess, the outcome remains uncertain. A larger physique bestows certain advantages, yet it also harbors inherent shortcomings. It is akin to an ordinary person attempting to swat a fly. Even if one possesses the strength to crush it 100 times, if one cannot land a blow, such power becomes futile. The skeletal beast embodies such a paradox, immense strength coupled with an unwieldy form. As a barrage of bony projectiles was unleashed, the skeletal beast transformed into a catapult, relentlessly assaulting Sarah in an attempt to eliminate him from a distance. Unfortunately for them, Sarah, the Black Knight, excels in close combat, his agility placing him among the elite of his peers. Despite the overwhelming force and clearly defined trajectories of the bombardment, he effortlessly evaded each attack. Chapter 25. The Fragile Alliance. While Sarah navigated the onslaught with remarkable ease, the undead engaged in battle behind him suffered greatly. Each bone ball that fell either collapsed walls or trampled through the masses, inevitably claiming dozens, if not hundreds, of skeletal lives. Yet, these victories bore no significance. Unless Sarah was vanquished, the slaughter of countless Black Knights would serve no purpose. This truth was not lost on Sarah, nor on the skeletal beast. Despite the beast's imposing size, its intellect was surprisingly high, surpassing that of many ordinary high-ranking undead. After all, with such a massive frame, its brain would naturally weigh more than others. Who is Sarah, you may ask? He is none other than the king of Black Knights, capable of conjuring Black Knights from thin air. If he were not defeated, even if the skeletal beast allied with General Decaying to annihilate all present Black Knights, their efforts would be in vain. Within a month, Sarah would undoubtedly reassemble a formidable force. Days prior, a fierce battle had unfolded, with their side gaining the upper hand through a surprise assault. Decaying emerged from the earth, coordinating a pincer attack with the skeletal beast that caught Sarah off guard. Yet, after a few days of recuperation, the skeletal beast and Decaying found themselves no worse for wear. Sarah, who had previously commanded fewer than 1,000 Black Knights, now boasted a force exceeding 10,000. Given a little more time to develop, the skeletal beast would stand no chance. Today he must be eliminated. With this thought, the skeletal beast suddenly let out a thunderous roar, and its tail erupted with bone blades, transforming from a cylindrical shape to that of a scorpion. Its tail was flanked by massive, protruding ribs. The ability was unleashed. Countless bones rose from the ground, swiftly coalescing into spheres upon the ribs. In the next moment, a deluge of bony projectiles rained down upon the city. This time, the assault was no longer comprised of enormous orbs, but rather a dense hailstorm of smaller projectiles, each the size of a wheel, hurtling towards the target. It can be said that encountering it means death, and brushing against it results in injury. The skeletal beast, indifferent to the presence of its subordinates below and the overwhelming majority of undead on its side, unleashed a barrage of devastating strikes. A thunderous roar erupted, leaving the third and fourth walls, positioned centrally, utterly disfigured. Some sections were even reduced to rubble. This predicament was particularly dire for Gu Erdan, who had intended to take advantage of the chaos by moving alongside the combatants, Decaying and Sarah. Suddenly confronted with such a relentless bombardment, he nearly lost his composure. His loyal subordinates, especially the 10 Black Knights, formed a makeshift shield wall in front, providing Gu Erdan with a semblance of psychological security. Yet, it offered only a fragile sense of safety. Should these bone projectiles strike, it was uncertain whether they could withstand even a single hit. Get down from the wall, quickly. Glancing at the unfortunate skeleton soldier, hurled more than 20 meters away by an explosive shell, Gu Erdan dared not linger any longer and hurriedly led his subordinates to leap down from the battlements. While Gu Erdan and his companions managed to evade the worst of the chaos, it was evident that their adversaries had not specifically targeted them. The true focus of the onslaught was Sarah. The previous single bombardments had been manageable to evade, but now, amidst the relentless rain of projectiles, finding refuge became a daunting task. After deftly dodging several bone missiles, another was seen plummeting directly in front of her. In a panic, Sarah attempted to roll away, only to feel an unexpected tightening at her feet, halting her mid-roll. To her shock, she discovered a thick veil of black mist had silently enveloped the ground, with numerous shadowy figures grasping at her armor with fervent intensity. Fourth ring, necromancy. Land of the dead. You. Sarah's eyes widened in fury, ready to retort, when a bone projectile struck her squarely in the face. With a resounding crash, Sarah was sent flying several meters, ultimately crashing against the wall. Ha ha ha, you finally got hit. Sarah, seizing the opportunity to gloat, Decaying, who had been lurking in the shadows, erupted into laughter, preparing to rush over to claim her as a trophy. However, at that moment, a bone projectile soared toward him from behind, striking his head with a dull thud. Poor Decaying, caught completely off guard, spun 3 times in the air before clattering to the ground. Dazed and disoriented, he struggled to rise. The first thing he did upon standing was to turn and angrily shout, "Damn it!" Aim properly. I'm on your side. Despite the severity of the blow, Decaying remained unscathed, for his defensive capabilities were nothing short of extraordinary. With a mid-level bone reinforcement ability, his physical resilience rivaled that of seasoned experts of the 7th or 8th tier, renowned for their defensive prowess. A mere small bone sphere poses no threat to him. Otherwise, how could this individual have chosen to ambush Sarah amidst a hail of projectiles? If there were genuine danger, he would have turned and fled long ago. The skeletal beast, currently positioned at the periphery and bombarding the area, remained silent, merely emitting a scornful snort from its nostrils. Allies. Such a term only applies when there are mutual benefits. Having already severely injured Sarah, the dynamics between them warrant reevaluation. Moreover, whether that recent bone sphere was a result of the skeletal beast's miscalculated aim or a deliberate act remains uncertain. With a sudden flick of its tail, the ribs above closed shut, locking back onto the tailbone. With a thunderous roar, another massive bone sphere soared into the sky, accurately crashing down into the ruins where Sarah was located. The approaching Doki, who had been charging toward that area, halted abruptly in fear upon witnessing this scene. He had confidence in the hardness of his own bones, but that was contingent upon what he was up against. Confronted with a small scattershot bone sphere, Doki felt assured that he could withstand one or two without harm. However, should he be struck head-on by such a colossal bone sphere, Doki feared he would either not survive or be left severely injured. The booming sound outside the city walls revealed that the skeletal beast, having launched this projectile, had begun to smash through the walls and charge in this direction. The intention was all too clear. Damn wild dog, Doki cursed, showing no hesitation as he surged forward with all his might. The enemy must be defeated. Following that, it would be time to claim the spoils of war. The partnership between the skeletal beast and Doki was forged solely for the pursuit of this coveted treasure. It lay tantalizingly before them. How could they refrain from seizing it? The two 5th-tier undead, one large and one small, raced ahead. Yet the skeletal beast's massive form allowed it to cover ground at a pace that matched Doki's 5 steps with just one. In an instant, it was on the verge of overtaking him. Faced with such a predicament, Doki would not permit it. Without a moment's thought, the skeletal general swung his blade, aiming directly at the skeletal beast, while dark energy surged around him, morphing into countless specters that howled as they lunged at the beast. With a swift motion, the phantoms, trailing long streams of black smoke like chains, ensnared the skeletal beast's limbs. Taken by surprise, it tightened its limbs and tumbled clumsily, its massive body crashing to the ground and sliding more than 4 meters. Ha ha ha! Doki laughed triumphantly, leaping over the fallen skeletal beast, eagerly advancing toward the ruins ahead to claim his spoils. Yet, in the next moment, a rush of wind surged from behind him, followed by a thunderous crash as a gigantic bone sphere shattered the wall, soaring above him, leaving him wide-eyed in astonishment. If he was not mistaken, this bone sphere bore the unmistakable impression of a complete large skeletal frame. Just as a dung beetle, in a moment of reckless acceleration, collided with a stone, sending its fecal ball, nay, its osseous sphere, soaring into the air alongside it. Upon closer inspection of the imprint above the osseous sphere, and confirming it was not that of the Dark Warrior, Gu Erdan hastily led his companions towards the city gate. Scaling the walls was too perilous. A single misstep could lead to ruin. It was wiser to proceed through the main entrance. At that very moment, in the heart of Wang City, Decaying was also struggling to rise from the ground. Fortunate to possess an ironclad form, he had not been obliterated by the recent explosion, though he had been forcefully pressed into the earth, leaving behind a sizable pit resembling the letter Y. Just as he finally extricated himself from the bone layer, a skeletal beast thundered past him, trampling him mercilessly underfoot. The weight of its foot was likely several hundred tons, eliciting a scream from Decaying as he was driven back into the bone layer once more. The skeletal beast, relentless in its pursuit, swung its colossal tail, a solid bone appendage nearly 2 meters thick, down upon him, akin to a massive iron hammer, plunging Decaying into the bone layer over half a meter deep. Such was the cruelty of its tactics, a lesson well learned. Yet, among the undead, malice was a common trait. None were superior in their wickedness. Boom. The frenzied charge of the skeletal beast was abruptly halted as black mist chains ensnared its forelimbs, dragging it across the ground for nearly 10 meters, its hindquarters rising perilously high, almost folding over. You wretched cur. Decaying's furious roar reverberated as he forcefully liberated himself from the earth, wielding a long-handled blade, and leaped forth with the agility of a tempest, directly assaulting the skeletal beast. Upon hearing the furious cry, the skeletal beast recognized the gravity of the situation and hastily swung its tail in an attempt to fend off the assailant. However, Decaying's movements were remarkably agile. As he leapt to evade the sweeping tail, dark energy coalesced in his grasp, transforming into a grotesque specter that launched itself like a cannonball towards the skeletal beast. With a resounding crack, the specter latched onto the skeletal beast. Decaying, utilizing the chain formed from the dark energy, swung upward, soaring into the sky, and landed precisely on the beast's back. Just then, Gu Erdan, rushing out from the city gate, could not help but exclaim in astonishment, "By heavens! Spider-Man! This is beyond your capability, you wretched dog. Begone!" Now atop the skeletal beast, Decaying was imbued with vigor as he brandished his blade, relentlessly stabbing and striking, causing the beast to thrash and leap in a frenzy, yet it could not dislodge its tenacious foe. Such was the lamentable truth of large creatures, especially those of a bestial nature. Their pitiful short legs could not reach their backs, rendering them helpless against adversaries perched upon them. Despite being pressed by Sarah, Decaying maintained the upper hand against the skeletal beast. The alliance between the two was forged out of a rather unfortunate circumstance. The skeletal beast, having been repelled by the formidable Decaying, found itself on the receiving end of a brutal thrashing instead. Of course, the skeletal beast's impressively thick armor was impervious to Decaying's attacks, leaving both parties in a stalemate where neither could gain the upper hand. After all, if either could easily vanquish the other, there would be no need for an alliance. Brandishing his long blade, Decaying relentlessly thrust at the skeletal beast below, his fervent curses echoing through the air. "Remember our agreement. The corpses belong to you. The ghostly flames are mine. Do not touch what is not yours." Feeling the pain radiating from his neck and hearing Decaying's furious shouts, the skeletal beast felt quite aggrieved. Despite possessing superior strength and prowess, it was thwarted merely by its smaller size and formidable resilience, leaving it unable to retaliate and instead subjected to Decaying's menacing reprimands. Corpses? Indeed. The skeletal beast could consume corpses to grow stronger, and a fifth-tier undead body would indeed be a treasure for it. However, under the influence of the ethereal ghostly flames, who in their right mind would covet a mere corpse, especially considering that it was Decaying who had dispatched the foe, and given its own considerable size, it logically deserved the greater share of the spoils. The more it pondered, the more incensed it became, until with a furious roar reminiscent of a rabid dog, the skeletal beast began to thrash about on the ground, sending bones flying and stirring up a tempest of dust. Decaying, caught off guard by this unexpected frenzy, found himself unceremoniously tossed from the beast's back, only to be subsequently crushed beneath its several hundred-ton weight, once again buried into the earth. Fortunately, the skeletal beast remained oblivious to this scene, continuing its wild rolling, struggling to emerge from the swirling dust. Decaying paid no heed to the frenzied creature and quickly dashed toward the ruins engulfing Sarah. At that moment, a piercing scream erupted from the side, a sound so jarring it sent chills down his spine. That rascal wishes to hoard it all for himself. The instant those words reached his ears, Decaying was startled into a tremor, his expression shifting dramatically as he turned to behold a massive tail whipping toward him with alarming speed. Boom! Decaying found himself once more slammed into the skeletal layer beneath him, though this time he was pinned against the wall, unable to escape. The skeletal beast, alerted and swift in its response, executed a seamless maneuver, turning and sweeping its tail with precision. In an instant, Decaying was dispatched, and the skeletal beast, undeterred, lunged toward the ruins, its colossal claws digging frantically in an effort to unearth Sarah. However, before it could achieve its goal, Decaying, now embedded in the wall, launched another assault. His weapon lost to the chaos, he disregarded the search for a new one. With a sweeping motion of his hands, dark energy surged forth from within, transforming into chains that soared outward. At their ends were the ghastly visages of tormented spirits. The sound of cracking chains filled the air as dozens ensnared the skeletal beast's features, pulling it backward with relentless force. Though the maneuver executed by Decaying was undeniably impressive, he overlooked the disparity in their physiques. The skeletal beast, whose head was forcibly lifted, suddenly struggled with great intensity, causing Decaying to feel an unexpected lightness in his body as he was yanked upward, spinning like a meteor hammer. Both were formidable opponents, once again engaging in a fierce confrontation. However, they failed to notice the ruins concealing Sarah trembling inexplicably. Beneath the debris, Gu Erdan directed his subordinates, specifically, two adept diggers endowed with the ability to burrow, who were tirelessly excavating. Chapter 27. The cat swaps the prince. Dig. Hurry up and dig. No, not downwards. You there? Pay attention and don't poke upwards. If we're discovered, we're all doomed. Ugh, this is infuriating. Step aside. I'll handle this myself. Observing the frantic efforts of his two underlings, Gu Erdan felt a piercing headache. In a fit of frustration, he shoved one aside and took charge, leading the others to excavate manually. The black warrior with the burrowing ability was manageable, Despite his lack of intellect, he possessed a basic comprehension. However, the other skeletal soldier, resembling a pile driver, was a source of despair for Gu Erdan after witnessing the chaos he caused while attempting to dig. As the saying goes, many hands make light work. With the collaborative effort of dozens of subordinates, Gu Erdan finally reached the ruins and successfully located his new leader, Sarah. Unfortunately, Sarah was in a dire state. If the skeletal general decaying was akin to a high defense, high health meat shield, then Sarah epitomized the agile warrior with high attack and speed. After taking a small bone projectile followed by a larger one, Sarah's body, though still intact, bore significant injuries. His armor was riddled with cracks, the helmet severely dented, and his left arm armor had crumpled into a folded version of its original form. Grasping Sarah's legs, Gu Erdan dragged him closer and delivered a resounding slap. "Hey, big brother, don't die on me. I haven't finished clinging to your leg yet." As he spoke, Gu Erdan raised his hand to strike again, only to find that the previous slap had roused Sarah from his stupor. Reflexively, Sarah seized Gu Erdan's wrist with a sudden surge of strength. A sharp crack echoed as Gu Erdan stared in disbelief at his right hand, now severed and lying on the ground, accompanied by a shower of bone fragments. In that moment, both Gu Erdan and the now-aware Sarah were frozen in place. "Oh, my royal power, my royal power." Waving his severed hand, Gu Erdan relentlessly pounded on Sarah's helmet, causing it to wobble. "Enough. Stop shouting. I will compensate you when we return." Sarah, slightly exasperated, pushed Gu Erdan away, causing him to fall silent at the promise of recompense. He grasped the severed hand lying on the ground and, with a casual flick, initiated a spell of bone regeneration. The fractured limb seamlessly restored itself. "If you had mentioned this earlier, I wouldn't have shouted." Gu Erdan chuckled, directing his subordinates to assist Sarah while signaling for a retreat. However, Sarah was gravely injured. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lost consciousness so abruptly. Particularly, his limbs were in dire straits, with one arm shattered into several pieces and both legs severely damaged, rendering him nearly immobile. Observing Sarah's incapacity to move, Gu Erdan ordered his men to carry him forward, though this would inevitably slow their pace. Casting a glance at the hollowed ruins and then at the severely wounded Sarah, Gu Erdan pondered for a moment, then abruptly strode to Sarah's side, tugging at his armor with considerable force. "Come on, off with the armor. Gu Erdan, are you attempting a coup?" Sarah, startled by Gu Erdan's actions, struggled fiercely. He was aware of Gu Erdan's previous attempts to seize the armor of his subordinates, one of whom, the unfortunate soul who had lost his armor, now stood nearby, helmeted and spectating. Yet, he never anticipated that this subordinate, who had risked his life to rescue him, would so shamelessly seize the opportunity to exploit him in such a vulnerable state. "I have no need for your armor. What use is it to me? Hurry and take it off." Gu Erdan, lacking the time to explain, aggressively removed Sarah's armor. Fortunately, the reason Sarah ceased to struggle was partly due to his resignation to the situation. Otherwise, given his 5th-tier undead strength, even in his weakened state, subduing a 2nd-tier Gu Erdan would have been effortless. As the armor was stripped away, Gu Erdan's gaze fell upon Sarah, causing him to pause in bewilderment. This reaction was not unfounded, for beneath the armor, Sarah was swathed in layers of thick bandages, resembling a tightly wrapped dumpling, evoking the image of a mummy. Sensing Gu Erdan's astonishment, Sarah instinctively raised his hand to shield his face and murmured, "No one wishes to become a shriveled monstrosity. It is better to conceal than to be a source of discomfort, is it not? Ugh, you're dead already. Why care about appearances? At least you still have a face. I've lost my entire head. Should I find a fake one to wear?" Gu Erdan retorted, simultaneously mocking him while hauling away the armor he had just removed. Sarah, upon hearing Gu Erdan's words, turned to look at him, fixating on the skull pendant that hung from his neck, which was audibly chattering, his mouth slightly agape. He hesitated before refraining from making any sarcastic remarks at that moment. This fellow had the audacity to critique him, yet he was currently adorned with someone else's head. Was his vanity greater than his own? Gu Erdan remained blissfully unaware of Sarah's thoughts. Otherwise, he would have surely yanked his head off and hurled it at him. Is he merely indulging in vanity? How superficial. This is a matter of life and death. When confronted by dogs, wolves, or formidable foes, tossing one's head towards them could very well save one's life. It is far better for another's head to be gnawed upon than to lose one's own precious life. Approaching the black warrior who had been stripped of his garments, Gu Erdan hesitated momentarily, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to act against him. What a splendid little brother he is, offering both his clothes and weapons. While his own inclination to rob was a factor, the warrior had not uttered a single complaint. Now he stood there, exposed to the elements. Moreover, during the digging earlier, this fellow had exerted himself the most, stripping him of his attire and seizing his belongings. Only to sell him off as cannon fodder would be utterly disgraceful. Shaking his head, Gu Erdan placed the helmet he held atop a nearby skeletal frame, hurriedly assisting him into his armor. After a flurry of activity, Gu Erdan forcibly pressed the now transformed skeletal soldier down beneath the rubble. Here, you have been assigned a formidable task. Do you see this? Sit still. Do not move. If you manage to survive, I shall appoint you as the vice captain, on par with the armored knights. Henceforth, you shall be known as the Bone Vanguard. Yes, from now on, you shall be called the Bone Vanguard. With that, Gu Erdan firmly patted his shoulder and led the others away, leaving the newly promoted Bone Vanguard alone amidst the chaos of the ruins. With a resounding boom, the fleeing Gu Erdan ordered his subordinates to seal the tunnel once more, concealing any evidence of their actions. As for the vanguard left behind, well, when calamity strikes, each must fend for themselves. Take care of yourself. Chapter 28. The battle for spoils. The battle above ground raged on, with General Decaying and the Bone Beast engaged in a fierce clash. The two invulnerable foes exchanged blows, leaving the surrounding spirits to suffer the consequences of their skirmish. Numerous souls were caught in the fray, facing imminent demise with the slightest misstep. Though there exists but a single tier of difference between the 5th and 4th levels, the disparity in combat prowess is vast. Levels 1 to 3 are deemed low-tier spirits, akin to cannon fodder among the undead. Levels 4 to 6 constitute mid-tier spirits, the elite among the elite. As for the ascending levels 7 to 9, they represent the quintessential high-tier spirits, possessing not only formidable combat abilities, but also intellect comparable to the living. Some, due to their extended existence, may even surpass humans in cunning. After all, the phrase old and crafty is no mere jest. This refers merely to the ordinary spirits. The 3 undead present are formidable 5th-tier beings, having clawed their way up from the fringes of the spirit realm. They are starkly different from those born in the central regions, who may arrive in the world with innate 5th-tier strength. Their combat experience is far more extensive, their minds sharper, and their overall fighting prowess significantly superior. A typical 5th-tier undead may require some time to contend with a 4th-tier counterpart, yet the individuals present, particularly the skeletal beast, can effortlessly dispatch their foes in an instant. Although the two combatants were caught up in their urgency, they refrained from engaging in a futile struggle. Recognizing that such an endeavor would be fruitless, akin to a hammer striking a weight, neither could gain the upper hand. While they fought, they simultaneously sought opportunities to excavate the ground, especially the skeletal beast. Once it unearthed Sarah from the ruins, it would undoubtedly seize her and flee. After all, it was currently incapable of inflicting effective harm upon Decaying. Continuing this way would only lead to its detriment. Once it devoured Sarah's soul and ascended to the 6th tier, it could return to settle the score with the insufferable opponent. Decaying, not lacking in intelligence, was acutely aware of the grand scheme of the colossal creature before him. However, his size rendered him incapable of effectively obstructing the skeletal beast's excavation. After a prolonged struggle lasting several minutes, a sharp crack resounded as the earth above the ruins was violently cast aside, revealing a gaping void beneath. Without pausing to ponder the reason behind the sudden emergence of a hollow space, the skeletal beast opened its cavernous maw and lunged ferociously at the substitute skeleton soldier within. The unfortunate skeletal figure, dutifully adhering to its commands, glanced up upon hearing the commotion, only to behold a skull larger than itself bearing down with malicious intent. The situation was unmistakably dire, as the beast clearly intended to use it as a mere chew toy. In that critical moment, Decaying sprang forth from the side, forcefully flinging his hand. The dark mist coalesced into chains that fiercely ensnared the skeletal vanguard's body. He could not move the colossal skeletal beast. Yet could he not also seize Sarah? With all his might, he yanked the skeletal vanguard towards himself, and in the horrified gaze of the skeletal beast, he hoisted the tightly bound figure onto his shoulder and turned to flee. Empowered by the abilities derived from the land of the dead, the spectral chains enabled Decaying to move with remarkable swiftness, swinging through the air like a pendulum, covering dozens of meters in a single motion. Decaying dashed ahead, with the skeletal beast in hot pursuit, howling frantically while whipping its tail to conjure bone projectiles in a desperate attempt to intercept Decaying. In the blink of an eye, they reached the perimeter of the outer wall. Unfortunately, as Decaying swung into position, he became ensnared. The chain in his hand struck by a bone projectile, sending him crashing against the wall. Despite rolling to the ground in a crumpled heap, Decaying's determination remained unyielding. Even as his helmet flew off and he found himself in disarray, he clung tenaciously to his prize, the skeletal vanguard. Regrettably, his resilience to such impacts did not extend to the skeletal vanguard, which was equally vulnerable. As the skeletal beast relentlessly pursued from behind, Decaying struggled to rise, bracing himself with one hand against the ground, only to freeze in disbelief. Gazing at the Sarah he held in his arms, his eyes widened in shock. Due to the astonishing revelation that this notoriously formidable foe was now devoid of its head, Deki nearly succumbed to a faint. After all, the essence of a typical undead is harbored within its cranium. Now, with the head missing, what had he fought for with such fervor? Desperately scouring the vicinity while lugging the lifeless body, Deki resembled an office worker who, having awoken late, could not locate his phone. The panic was palpable. Fortunately, the trophy's severed head had not rolled too far. Deki swiftly spotted the familiar helmet a mere dozen meters away. As he scrambled to retrieve it, he beheld the severely deflated helmet in his hands, leaving him utterly perplexed. This was not right. Despite Sarah's lack of defensive prowess, he was still a fifth-tier undead. A black knight naturally endowed with formidable defenses. The heavy armor, the brooding design, it was unmistakably a robust shell. How could its defenses possibly be feeble? While losing one's head might be conceivable, having it detached through a fall, surely, he could not be so fragile. Moreover, even a skeletal soldier would not be so brittle post the fifth tier. Deki himself was a testament to that. There was something amiss. Absolutely something amiss. Could it be that this creature possessed some talent for dismemberment? A unique necromantic spell? Was it the second-tier limb severance spell? Or perhaps the fifth-tier corpse rupture spell? The more Deki pondered, the more he sensed an underlying anomaly. After a brief moment of silence, gazing at the helmet in his grasp, he abruptly discarded the headless corpse and exerted both hands with vigor. In the next instant, the helmet's visor was forcibly pried open, revealing the skeletal head within, wildly moving its jaw in a futile attempt to bite him, leaving him in a state of silent astonishment. At that moment, a rush of wind announced the arrival of the skeletal beast, which roared ferociously, lunging towards him with its cavernous jaws agape. Without turning his head, Deki seized the helmeted skull and hurled it forcefully towards the beast below. Witnessing this scene, the skeletal beast abandoned its intent to attack Deki, abruptly changing direction. With its small front paws frantically pushing against the ground, it executed a hasty stop, catching the skull in a split second. Without a moment's hesitation, the skeletal beast turned and fled, adopting a rather comical stance as it ran on its hind legs. The sight of its lizard-like, swaying gait was utterly hilarious. Yet, as it sprinted, the skeletal beast suddenly halted. The abrupt stop caused it to plop down, sliding 2 meters across the ground, staring blankly at the skull in its possession. The skeletal beast was momentarily dumbfounded. Meanwhile, behind it, Deki's voice, laced with fury, echoed, a switcheroo. We've been deceived. Sarah is still in the city. At this, the skeletal beast whipped around, locking eyes with Deki. Though no words were exchanged, both understood a singular message through the intensity of their gazes. How could they treat him like a mere fool? Ceasefire. Retreat. Eliminate him. Chapter 29, On the Art of Deception. A thunderous tremor echoed as the colossal skeletal beast abruptly changed direction, charging relentlessly towards the city of Black Knights. The skeletal general, Durgi, followed closely behind, his eyes flickering with fury, clearly beyond enraged. They had been outsmarted. After laboriously plotting for so long, he had even resorted to using himself as bait, enduring the skeletal beast's assault to forcibly delay Sarah. What was it all for? Merely to obtain a high-grade soul flame. If he failed to acquire Sarah's soul flame today, Durgi feared he might die of frustration anew. Roaring in a manner unprecedented for a non-speaking skeletal beast, it lunged forward, crashing into the already battered city walls with a resounding impact. At this moment, not only was the skeletal general Durgi infuriated, but the skeletal beast was equally wrathful. Previously ambushed by Durgi, it had been ruthlessly beaten down, forced into reluctant cooperation. Initially, mutual benefit seemed plausible. Acquiring a corpse would be advantageous, while capturing a soul would yield great profit. If both could be secured, the skeletal beast believed it could soar to new heights. Yet now, having obtained nothing, it faced rebukes and blows, its head ringing from the collision. What was the purpose of all this? Why endure such humiliation? If it did not feast today, how could it ever show its face again? In a frenzy, the two charged towards the city center, wreaking havoc and scattering bones in their wake, with numerous minions tragically meeting their demise beneath the skeletal beast's feet. One wall after another crumbled under their assault, due to the absence of any structures within the city. They could easily glimpse the interior as they broke through. The fourth wall, absent. The fifth wall, still missing. The sixth wall, still no sign. Just as they barreled towards the final wall, the skeletal beast suddenly halted, its massive form dragging upon the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. To its left, a small squad of skeletal soldiers and Black Knights stealthily maneuvered along the wall. Such formations were not unusual in the city of Black Knights, as they excelled in small group tactics, instinctively gathering in groups of dozens during combat. However, What was peculiar about this particular team was that at its center, heavily shielded, stood not a captain of the Black Knights, but rather a figure clad in tattered armor, adorned with a damaged helmet, appearing shrouded and hindered in mobility. From a distance, it resembled a skeletal soldier, with a few ribs strapped on its back for disguise. But the skeletal beast knew better. It was the Hound of Death. Upon the head, there exists a dearth of anything substantial, save for an abundance of eye sockets. How many pairs of eyes might there be within the canine skull composed of hundreds, if not thousands, of skeletal remains? The skeletal beast, quick to discern the anomalies within this small troop, watched as General decaying vaulted over the city wall. Instead of alerting him, the beast suddenly crouched low, completely prostrating itself to conceal its massive form behind the low wall. Such a large physique, hidden behind a barrier barely 2 or 3 meters high, is indeed a remarkable feat, creeping stealthily, striving to evade decaying's gaze. The skeletal beast advanced with a comical yet ferocious speed toward the unsuspecting squad ahead. With a resounding crash, the skeletal beast lunged forward, its head smashing through the ranks of the entire troop. The mixed breed squad, numbering around 40 to 50, suffered devastating losses, with nearly all the skeletal soldiers perishing, and the dark-armored black warriors sustaining grievous injuries. Unperturbed by these lesser foes, and oblivious to the fragility of the black warriors, the skeletal beast clamped its jaws around the individual ensconced in the center, heavily guarded by his comrades, and without a moment's hesitation, prepared to swallow him whole. However, at that very instant, the adjacent wall erupted, and a figure leapt forth, delivering a forceful kick to the beast's cheek. The skeletal beast had indeed concealed itself remarkably well. Perhaps it was the awakening of its instinctual hunting genes that allowed for its seamless subterfuge. Yet, circumstances dictate outcomes. The once boisterous giant beside it fell silent, leading even the dimmest of minds to suspect foul play. Arriving just in time, decaying launched a kick in an attempt to reclaim his prize, but alas, he was a moment too late. Possessing immense tenacity, the skeletal beast would not relinquish its hard-won prize. Even when knocked to the ground by the force of the kick, it refused to let go. In the very instant it was sent sprawling, the creature executed a dramatic roll, simultaneously distancing itself while furiously clawing at the earth. Though this dog-paddling maneuver appeared comical, when coupled with the beast's colossal size, its effectiveness was anything but trivial. A torrent of sand and bone erupted, catching the hastily advancing decaying off guard, causing his body to sway unsteadily while his vision was entirely obscured by the swirling dust. To make matters worse, the skeletal beast seized the opportunity to pursue, whipping its tail to conjure a massive bone sphere that struck General decaying squarely in the face. This unfortunate soul found himself once again smashed against the wall, and by the time he struggled to rise, the skeletal beast had already scampered away. Witnessing the hard-earned spoils of battle, which he had valiantly fought to obtain, being snatched away by this wretched beast ignited a fiery rage within decaying. With fury coursing through him, he let out a howl and charged forward, utilizing the unique power of his magic to swing toward the skeletal beast in pursuit. 2 fifth-order undead swiftly retreated, leaving the battlefield devoid of their presence. The ragtag army they had brought began to be systematically dismantled by the Black Knights, and the skirmish concluded in less than an hour. Once the commotion outside had completely subsided, within the depths of the cavern several meters below ground, the severely injured Sarah struggled to lift his head and gaze upwards. It appeared that the battle had come to an end. Should we venture out to investigate? Beside him, Gu Erdan, who was recklessly warming himself by the fire, intently watched the crackling flames gradually extinguishing, replying without lifting his gaze. How can you be certain your side emerged victorious? The cessation of combat might very well indicate that your forces were annihilated. Let us wait a while longer. Wait. Until when? A day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks. Who cares? After all, we undead are eternal. We can afford to bide our time. Gu Erdan was in no rush. Ever since he discovered his transformation into an undead being, freeing him from concerns of mortality, he had developed a penchant for caution in all endeavors. However, a lack of risk does not equate to a lack of recklessness, and at present, he was engaged in an absurd experiment. He had ignited a fire within the enclosed cavern, depleting the already scarce oxygen. Had a living person been present, they would have succumbed to asphyxiation by now. Yet Gu Erdan was different. As an undead, he had no need for breath. Thus he was eager to ascertain whether a skeleton could indeed experience the sensation of suffocation. To put it plainly, he was simply indulging in folly. Chapter 30. A glimmer in despair. The small team, hidden deep underground, could not remain concealed for long. Sarah was impulsive, always rushing into action and relishing high-stakes situations. This was evident when confronted by formidable foes. He did not contemplate bolstering defenses, but instead sought to lure the undead into battle, attempting to forcibly augment his forces. After a brief wait within the cavern, Sarah's dwindling patience compelled him to direct his soldiers to excavate the earth. Yet he was prudent in his approach, initially dispatching only one individual to ensure the surroundings were secure and that victory was assured before leading his men to the surface. As for Gu Erdan, with all his companions having departed, he could no longer choose to remain sequestered in the dim confines. Emerging to the surface, he surveyed the devastated city and could not help but click his tongue in astonishment. The destructive power of the skeletal beast was indeed formidable. Its movements were akin to a cataclysm, and had it not been for his colossal frame breaching the city walls, the city might not have fallen so swiftly. Nevertheless, Sarah was, after all, the king of the Black Knights. Despite the apparent advantage held by the skeletal beast and the skeleton general, this was merely an illusion. It was only through the painstakingly gathered fodder that they managed to create a fleeting opportunity to confront Sarah in single combat. And that was only because Sarah had taken the initiative to engage. Had he chosen to evade the confrontation, the two would ultimately have been expelled from the city by the Black Knight Legion, although the losses on the part of the Black Knights would likely have been significant. After all, the skeletal beasts possess an extraordinary lethality when confronting lesser undead. They have momentarily retreated, without the skeletal legion to draw fire. The two dare not engage the Black Knight Corps directly, ensuring our relative safety for the time being. Severely injured, Sarah commands the Black Knights to lure the newly spawned skeletons into the city from the rear canyon, all while unsteadily making her way back to the heart of the city, not forgetting to explain to Gu Erdan along the way. Before long, the departing Black Knights return, and thousands of skeletal soldiers reappear in the rear. Sarah raises her hand, once again beginning to absorb the souls of the skeletons to restore both her own and the Black Knight Corps' injuries. Gu Erdan stands nearby, glancing at the blood rose flag planted beside them, his brow suddenly furrowing. Those two fellows came for your soul fire, did they not? Indeed. While the undead are ageless and immortal, they possess a critical flaw. Their growth cycle is excessively lengthy. If they were to evolve naturally, it could take centuries to ascend even one rank. However, consuming soul fire can expedite the process, provided they devour soul fire of equal or greater rank. This region lies on the outskirts of the realm of the undead, where the number of 5th-rank skeletons is limited. Thus, we will always seek ways to eliminate one another to facilitate our soul evolution. Sarah's explanation prompts Gu Erdan to nod repeatedly, yet his confusion deepens. Pointing towards the flag, Gu Erdan gazes at the skulls above, particularly the 5th-rank bull-headed skeleton at the pinnacle, his eyes filled with bewilderment. But do you not have a ready 5th-rank soul fire right here? Why do they not take it, opting instead to risk their lives against you? What is this? Your soul's fragrance? Huh. Souls bear no scent. They are evaluated solely by rank. As for why those two do not come for this soul, Sarah looks up at the bull-headed skeleton, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes, and suddenly reaches out to remove the skull, directly handing it to Gu Erdan. See for yourself. What the? Gu Erdan, who had been utterly perplexed, undergoes a dramatic transformation in expression the moment he touches the skull. The once 5th-rank soul fire transforms into a mere 2nd-rank pale green flame upon his contact. Sensing something amiss, Gu Erdan hastily activates his system. In the next moment, information about the flame appears before him. Name, 2nd-rank soul fire identity. Consumable skills, 1st ring undead spell. Amplification technique, 2nd ring undead spell. Soul disguise description. You may scare away pigs by masquerading as a tiger, but you might also attract hunters. Fake. Gazing at the counterfeit in his hand, Gu Erdan exclaims, drawing a smile and a shake of the head from Sarah. Of course it is fake. If it were real, I would have consumed it long ago. How could it possibly dangle from the flag as bait otherwise? Sarah cheerfully reclaims the skull and repositions it on the flag. This individual possesses an exceptionally unique talent, capable of concealing his own soul's essence to a remarkable 6th tier, while also increasing his size to appear quite formidable. It startled me at first. I was taken aback. Subsequently, I spent months organizing a team to prepare for his forced capture, only to discover that he was merely a counterfeit of the 2nd tier. Reflecting on the past, Sarah felt a mix of amusement and frustration. Eventually, I deemed this artifact useful enough to display it here, and indeed, it has provided significant assistance during this period. The last time when Decay and the Bone Beast invaded, it was this very item that diverted the Bone Beast's attention, allowing me to barely repel their combined assault. Unfortunately, it could only deceive once. They would not fall for it again. Indeed, they will not be deceived again. Gu Erdan nodded, his tone laced with concern. Our little trick of substituting a prince with a raccoon is unlikely to fool them again. Those two have suffered little injury. They merely need to gather a host of cannon fodder to retaliate. But how long will it take for you to recover? It is understandable that Gu Erdan harbored such worries, for Sarah was indeed gravely injured. Upon hearing Gu Erdan's words, Sarah chuckled and shook her head. Do not fret. The undead are inherently unperturbed by injuries. As long as my soul's flame remains unharmed, I can mend these corporeal wounds by absorbing a bit of soul fire. I shall be well in no time. This was indeed encouraging news, yet the problem remained that even if you fully recovered, you would still be no match for the two of them. Rubbing his bare skull, Gu Erdan nearly had his head bitten, and he gave the skeleton a fierce slap while voicing his concerns. His words plunged Sarah into silence. Clearly, the two adversaries had discovered a means of synergistic attack. Relying solely on herself, she was no longer their equal. What would she do if they launched another assault? Forcefully obstruct them? That could very well lead to her demise on the spot. Yet if she refrained from intervening, allowing them to unleash their fury, how many rounds of slaughter could her Black Knights endure? Trading her painstakingly assembled Black Knight Legion for the cannon fodder they casually recruited would be an unequivocal loss. A new strategy must be devised. Just as Sarah was racking her brains for a solution, Gu Erdan gazed up at the flag, and a spark of inspiration illuminated his mind. I have an idea. Perhaps we can evade this crisis and even turn the tide in our favor.